Imagine walking into a medieval kitchen. The air is warm, smoky, and full of the unmistakable perfume of dinner. Except dinner doesn't smell like herbs or roasting meat. No, it smells like hope mixed with anxiety and a sprinkle of, please don't let this eliminate me. Because in the medieval world, freshness was less a category and more a belief system, one that hinged on time, temperature, and the bravery of whoever was cooking that day. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To understand medieval fresh, you must first forget everything you know about refrigerators, expiration dates, and the concept of food not sweating on the table. Most ingredients had a shelf life of whatever time of day it currently was, plus maybe an hour if you prayed, minus 30 minutes if it was summer. The moment a fish was caught, a vegetable was pulled, or a chicken was relieved of its responsibilities, the clock started ticking. Medieval people didn't aim for fresh. They aimed for not visibly fermenting, and even then, visible was subjective. Since preservation methods, the ones that did exist, were laborious, expensive, or inconsistent, most food was eaten as soon as possible. Not because it tasted better when fresh, but because it tasted less alarming. A rabbit caught in the morning. Fresh, a rabbit caught yesterday. Still fresh if it hasn't developed an attitude. A rabbit caught the day before yesterday. Now it's a stew, because stewing conveniently hides suspicious aromas, textures, and questions. Heat made everything worse. Medieval summers weren't just hot, they were a seasonal punishment. Imagine storing a bucket of milk on a table at noon. That milk isn't sitting there peacefully, it's waging a microscopic revolution. Within hours, it's turned into something between yogurt, regret, and a new life form deserving its own surname. Before microscopes, thermometers, or a scientific understanding of bacteria, medieval people relied on the most advanced diagnostic tool available: their noses. The nose was judge, jury, and executioner. If something smelled off, that usually meant one of three things. It had already spoiled, it was on its way to spoiling, it was medieval cheese and smelled like that on purpose. Odour wasn't just guidance, it was survival. Medieval food safety checks went as follows. Step 1, smell it. Step 2, squint suspiciously. Step 3, smell it again just in case your nose lied. Step 4, ask someone else to smell it because you hope their nose is braver. Step 5, cook it anyway. The good news, your dinner isn't rotten. The bad news, that's because it's still alive. Yes, sometimes the food moved. A sack of grain might wiggle with weevils. A hunk of meat might breathe a little from trapped gases. Freshness wasn't the absence of creatures, it was the absence of creatures large enough to fight you for ownership. Sight, rather unfortunately, didn't do much to help medieval people determine if food had gone bad. Many foods that spoiled didn't change colour dramatically. Meat might darken, but unless it turned a shade previously unknown to human vision, you tolerated it. Vegetables shriveled, but medieval vegetables shriveled on day 2 regardless of spoilage. People knew mould was bad unless it wasn't. Some mould was just cut off like a bad haircut. Bread developed fuzzy hats. Hard cheese developed entire fungal biographies. Medieval advice was basically, if you can remove it with a knife, the food beneath is still morally upright. We tend to rely on texture. Crisp lettuce, firm peaches, meat that springs back when poked. Medieval people had texture-based expectations too. They just didn't match ours. For instance, meat that was slightly slimy, wash it in vinegar. Good as new. Fish a bit mushy, must be a soft fish. Milk separating into layers like geological strata. That's just natural thickening. Texture wasn't an alarm, it was a personality trait. If your household didn't eat something quickly, the weather decided when it expired. Medieval chroniclers occasionally complained that a hot season made people and food smell equally tragic. Warm spells turned kitchens into microbial carnivals. Cold spells preserved everything except human fingers. The entire idea of freshness depended on temperature, something people couldn't control except by murmuring complaints about God's choices. Believe it or not, animals had a starring role in telling medieval people whether their food was edible. Cats circled suspiciously around butcher stalls. Dogs sniffed the fishmonger's wares with the critical eye of a Michelin inspector. Flies arrived instantly for the worst pieces. If animals avoided something, humans took notice. Of course, this didn't always stop them from eating it. It just made them eat faster. Ultimately, medieval fresh wasn't a guarantee of quality. It was a window of opportunity before decomposition won the battle. The idea of eating something at its peak was foreign. You simply ate food within the narrow span where it wasn't actively hostile. People developed an impressive tolerance for flavours modern eaters would politely return to the chef with a small scream. Slight tanginess, normal, faint funk, acceptable, strong funk, a challenge, overpowering funk, stew time. Freshness was a spectrum, and medieval people lived on the wilder side of it. If the last part was about the medieval definition of fresh, then this part is about the medieval definition of planning, which can best be summarised as eat everything before the weather changes, or the weather will change you. Medieval life was built around the seasons, not in a poetic, the leaves are turning, how lovely sort of way, but in a if this harvest fails, we're all doomed sort of way. In a world without freezers, supermarkets, or neighbours who would let you borrow a cup of sugar, the calendar wasn't just a measurement of time, it was a survival schedule, an edible year in review. What you ate, when you ate it, and how much you had left, all depended on where the earth currently was in relation to the sun. A medieval menu wasn't created by chefs. It was dictated by nature, weather, and the collective panic of an entire village staring at dwindling storage barrels. Spring was the moment people remembered what plants looked like when they were alive. But don't be fooled, spring wasn't a time of abundance. It was a time of anxiety. Winter supplies were running low, everything left in storage was approaching its don't ask questions phase, and the fields hadn't produced anything new yet. This was the season of, let's boil these handfuls of withered herbs and call it soup. Eating dried peas for the 5th week in a row, pretending last year's turnip still counts as a vegetable. Farmers carefully check the fields every morning, like anxious parents peeking at a sleeping newborn. Did the frost kill the seedlings? Will we make it 2 more months? Why is that barrel in the cellar bubbling? Humour line: spring meant new crops. It also meant discovering what horrifying things you stored last winter. And horrifying they were, jars whose contents separated into colours not found in nature, bins of roots that had begun to sprout, rot, or develop personalities, grain bags that rustled suspiciously when touched. Spring was the moment medieval people asked themselves, should food crunch like that? Was the turnip supposed to have tentacles? Is this cheese trying to escape? Summer was paradise, if paradise came with constant humidity, insects, and the perpetual fear of thunderstorms. This was when the fields finally burst with produce, animals fattened, and everyone had more food than they knew what to do with. But summer abundance had one major flaw: everything spoiled fast. If winter was the season of not enough, summer was the season of too much, but only for 5 minutes. Food had to be eaten, dried, smoked, stored, or sacrificed to the gods before the sun cooked it on the spot. Still, this was the happiest the medieval stomach ever got. Fresh berries, milk that hadn't turned rebellious, vegetables that looked alive on purpose. Families feasted because they could, and because they knew hunger would return like an unwelcome seasonal subscription service. Autumn was the medieval equivalent of Black Friday, except instead of buying things, you were desperately trying to not die in winter. This was harvest time, the most important moment of the entire year. Grain had to be cut, dried, threshed, winnowed, stored, guarded, blessed, and occasionally yelled at. Fruits were picked, sliced, dried, or turned into cider. Vegetables were hauled into root cellars. Meat preservation began in earnest, but that's a chapter for later. This was the season of collective panic masked as productivity. Every able-bodied person participated. Even children were given jobs, usually involving carrying something heavier than they were. If the harvest was good, people breathed easily. If the harvest was poor, people did not breathe at all. They wheezed through the winter, plagued by fear and the sound of increasingly empty barrels. Winter was not a season. It was a judgment. A cold, merciless performance review of how well you handled autumn. Everything you had saved, preserved, fermented, dried, or forgotten you stored was now in rotation. The menu shifted from fresh options to whatever we put in that jar back in October. Please let it still be recognisable. Dinner became an archaeological dig into your own pantry. Grain? You're eating bread for months. Salted meat? Congratulations. Chew slowly. Root vegetables? Delicious, assuming they didn't become root communities. That jar of something unidentifiable. It's a surprise. Bon appetit. Winter meals were rarely exciting, but they were predictable, slightly bland, slightly tough, and slightly worrying. Between late winter and early spring lurked the infamous hunger season, the annual event nobody looked forward to. This was the bleak stretch when supplies ran dangerously low. Nothing had grown yet. Everyone regretted how much they ate during Christmas festivities. Food became a constant negotiation with fate. During the hunger season, meals got thinner, smaller, and more experimental. Food stretching became an Olympic sport. Gruels were watered down. Bread were bulked with peas, oat husks, or whatever ground plant material looked least toxic. People tracked the last pieces of food like accountants balancing their final coins. Every decision became existential. Do we eat this today and risk starving tomorrow, or eat half today and starve more slowly? It was not a cheerful time, but it was a defining one. Ultimately, medieval people survived not by mastering food, but by respecting the seasons like strict landlords. The calendar controlled appetite and meals, storage, mood, health, and the ever-present fear that this might be the year crops failed entirely. The medieval diet was not built on flavour preferences, it was built on timing. When the earth offered bounty, you devoured it. When the earth slept, you tightened your belt and prayed your neighbour didn't look too edible. If you asked a medieval person where their refrigerator was, they'd point to the ground. Not the floor, the actual ground. Dirt was the great cooling technology of the Middle Ages. Forget sleek stainless steel appliances with adjustable drawers and LED touchscreens. The medieval fridge had one temperature setting, hope, and honestly, that was generous. Yet despite the lack of mechanical parts, electricity, or anything resembling modern engineering, root cellars remain one of the most brilliant, practical, and reliable food storage inventions humans ever created. They were the backbone of winter survival, the quiet heroes beneath the earth, and the reason medieval vegetables didn't immediately collapse into goo. What exactly is a root cellar? A root cellar was basically a man-made cave, dug into a hillside under a house or built partially above ground and buried with soil. It took advantage of the earth's natural insulation, staying cool in summer and above freezing in winter. Medieval people didn't know the exact science, but they definitely understood the results. Things stored underground lasted longer, tasted better, and didn't turn into mush as quickly. The concept was simple. Dig a hole deep enough, make sure you don't hit groundwater, add shelves, bins, hooks, and prayers, fill with everything you hope won't rot immediately. Some cellars had walls made of stone, some were lined with timber, some were literally just holes with boards placed on top to keep animals, rain, and overly curious neighbours out. The design didn't matter as long as the temperature stayed low and the food stayed put. Earth, the medieval climate control system. The magic of a root cellar wasn't magic at all, it was physics, though medieval people would have described it more poetically. Something like, the earth is cool because God is merciful. Buried several feet below the surface, the ground maintains a surprisingly stable temperature year-round, hovering between 45 to 52 degrees, 7 to 13 degrees, depending on the region. To medieval people who lived at the mercy of seasonal chaos, this consistency felt miraculous. This coolness slowed spoilage and kept vegetables crisp, or at least less floppy than they would have been otherwise. The cellar didn't have to be perfect, it just had to be colder than the kitchen, which was permanently heated by cooking fires, bodies and despair. Humidity, the invisible saviour. Temperature was only half the secret. The other? Humidity. Root vegetables dry out if stored in low humidity. Medieval people didn't talk about moisture levels or vapour exchange, but they absolutely understood that. Carrots kept in damp sand lasted longer. Cabbages stored in moist earth stayed crunchy. Turnips didn't shrivel into rock-hard disappointments. Some cellars were naturally humid due to soil composition or groundwater proximity. Others required clever additions, buckets of water to increase humidity, ventilation shafts to reduce condensation, floor trenches to catch drips from sweating walls, straw layers to trap moisture and insulate vegetables. Everything was a balancing act. Too dry and your food turned into petrified vegetables, too wet and it sprouted, moulded, or dissolved into dramatic flavours you did not want. Darkness. The medieval anti-spoilage strategy. Sunlight is great for growing vegetables. It is terrible for storing them. Light encourages sprouting, discoloration, and general plant misbehaviour. So medieval root cellars were dark. Extremely dark. The kind of dark where you can only see your hand if your hand is glowing from divine intervention. This darkness slowed sprouting in onions, potatoes where available, garlic and other long storage crops. It also discouraged insects which preferred warmth and light, not cold medieval caves filled with judgment. For medieval cooks, entering the root cellar meant carrying a candle, stepping carefully, and hoping not to grab something alive or aggressively soft. Vegetables stored like VIP guests. Root cellars weren't just casual storage areas, they were organised with startling precision. Everything had its place. 1. Root vegetables, the stars. Carrots, parsnips, beets, turnips, rutabagas. These were packed in crates of sand, sawdust, straw or loose soil to mimic their natural environment. Medieval people essentially tricked vegetables into thinking they were still underground, blissfully unaware they were destined for soup. 2. Cabbages, stored hung upside down like leafy bats. This prevented rot by keeping moisture away from the core. 3. Apples, spread out on shelves to prevent bruising. One rotten apple really could spoil the bunch. 4. Onions and garlic, did and hung from beams to keep them dry and ventilated. 5. Pears, mesime, stored wrapped individually in leaves. Because pears spoil dramatically, they go from unripe rocks to mushy catastrophes overnight. Ventilation, the unsung hero. Even underground, cellars needed airflow. Stagnant air caused condensation, mould, and the smell of vegetables slowly plotting rebellion. So people installed vent stacks, small shutters, crude chimneys, gaps in stone walls. Airflow prevented the cellar from becoming a swamp of rot, and it carried away the ethylene gas released naturally by ripening produce. Though medieval people didn't know this, they just knew air good, stink bad. Seasonal cellar. Management. A year-round chore, root cellars were not set it and forget it. They required regular inspections moving vegetables so rot didn't spread, checking shelves for moisture, removing anything funky, suspicious, or attempting to grow legs. Recording what was running low. Medieval families often visited the cellar daily during winter. It was both pantry and survival scoreboard, the social life of a root cellar. Believe it or not, the root cellar wasn't just a storage space, it appeared in household tours. Look at all our turnips, please be impressed. Marriage negotiations. He has his own cellar. Wealth. Community gossip. I heard Lady Margaret's cabbages moulded. A well-stocked cellar meant prosperity. An empty one meant a hard winter. In the end, dirt saved lives. Root cellars, were low-tech, low-cost and incredibly effective. They didn't stop spoilage forever, but they slowed it long enough for families to endure winter without resorting to existential decisions of what counts as food. They were the quiet, dark, earthy guardians of the medieval household, a world where the most valuable appliance wasn't a glowing icebox humming in the kitchen, but a hole in the ground humming with possibility. If root cellars were the medieval refrigerator, salting was the medieval force field, an edible shield forged from tiny white crystals. Salt didn't just preserve food, it intimidated spoilage. It bullied moisture into submission. It declared war on bacteria and usually won. When a medieval person said something was salted, they didn't mean it was lightly sprinkled for flavour. They meant the food had been packed, buried, drowned, suffocated and spiritually overwhelmed by salt. Medieval salted meat wasn't seasoned, it was embalmed. And everyone ate it anyway, because the alternative was hunger, disease, or a winter diet consisting entirely of turnips, a torture even the bravest knight feared. Salt, the white gold of the Middle Ages. Before discussing how salting worked, it's important to understand why salt mattered so much. Salt wasn't a casual ingredient, it was an economic powerhouse. It funded cities, drove trade, filled tax coffers, and occasionally started wars. Salt was expensive because, 1, it was time-consuming to produce. Medieval salt came from salt mines, dangerous, dark, and full of the medieval version of OSHA violations. Salt pans evaporating seawater under the sun, boiling brine extracted from springs or marshes. None of this was easy. All of it took labour, fuel, tools, and a riskier relationship with the weather. 2. Demand was huge. Every household, monastery, army, farm, and fishery needed salt. A large estate might use hundreds of pounds of it in a year, because preservation required more salt than cooking ever did. 3. Governments taxed salt like it was liquid gold. Rulers loved nothing more than taxing necessities, and salt was the perfect target. Salt taxes filled royal treasuries, emptied peasant pockets, and ensured smuggling routes stayed in business. The irony? Salt was common. Oceans and underground deposits were full of it, but processed, usable salt was a luxury. How salting actually worked. Salting was elegant in its brutality. The science is simple. Salt pulls moisture out of food, and without moisture, bacteria die sad, thirsty deaths. Medieval people didn't know the microbiology, but they absolutely understood that food with salt lasts, food without salt betrays you. There were 2 main methods. 1. Dry salting, aka the salt avalanche method. You take meat or fish, you lay it out, you bury it in a mountain of salt so thoroughly that archaeologists might discover it 500 years later and so assume it was a ritual sacrifice. Salt was packed into every fold, crevice and surface. For large cuts, the meat was layered like geological strata. A layer of salt, a layer of meat, a layer of salt. Repeat until you lose the will to live. The salt sucked out moisture, creating brine, which then soaked back into the food. Over days or weeks, the meat transformed into something tougher, drier, saltier, and much less appealing to microorganisms. Or to humans, honestly. 2. Brining, aka medieval meat spa. If you combine salt and water, you get brine, a liquid so salty it could preserve a whole feast. Meat or fish was submerged completely and left to soak for days, weeks, or even months. Brine was especially useful for irregular cuts or large quantities. Some medieval households reused brine until it smelled like it had seen too much. Others added herbs, spices, or beer for flavour, though flavour is generous. The salt overwhelmed everything. Salted meat, the winter champion. Salted meat was the backbone of winter diets. Cows, pigs, and sheep were slaughtered in late autumn when weather was cool and feed was scarce. Most households didn't have the resources to keep animals alive through winter, so salting became essential. Salted beef, mutton, bacon and pork became staples. They were hung in barrels, stored in casks, kept in cool rooms, occasionally guarded from opportunistic animals and hungry children. Salted meat wasn't tender. It wasn't juicy. It didn't melt in your mouth. It sat in your mouth like a challenge. People soaked it for hours or even boiled it multiple times to make it edible. Even then, it tasted like someone had cooked a shoe inside the Dead Sea, but it kept you alive. Salted fish, the medieval superstar. Fish preservation was an empire-level industry. Salted herring, cod and other fish fed millions. Coastal towns thrived on fishing, salting and exporting fish across Europe. Salted fish fed. Peasants, monks, sailors, soldiers, cities, entire kingdoms, observing religious fasting days. It was a food of endurance, a food of practicality, a food that could survive storage, travel and questionable conditions. Fresh fish spoiled fast. Salted fish lasted months or even years if kept dry. Some salted fish was so tough sailors needed axes to break it. Imagine attacking your dinner before it attacks you. Medieval life was exciting like that. Salted butter. Because even butter needed armour. Butter spoils quickly, unless salt steps in like a knight in shining armour. Salted butter could last much longer in cool climates or well-sealed containers. In wealthier homes and northern regions, salted butter was packed into jars wrapped in cloth sealed with wax or brine, stored underground or in cool pantries. It wasn't always pleasant. Salted butter could be overwhelmingly salty or develop peculiar flavours, but it didn't rot, and that's all that mattered. The cultural importance of salt preservation. Salting shaped medieval food culture. It determined when animals were slaughtered, what food filled winter tables, the taste of daily meals, trade routes, economics, religious fasting diets, naval exploration, military campaigns. Without salting, medieval life collapses. Armies cannot march. Ships cannot sail. Monks cannot fast properly. Households cannot survive winter. Salt is the quiet hero behind every bowl of pottage and every bite of preserved fish. In the end, salt was survival. Salting wasn't glamorous. It wasn't delicious. It wasn't convenient. But it worked. And in the Middle Ages, working was the only requirement. It allowed food to endure weeks, months, or seasons longer than nature intended. It didn't enhance ingredients. It protected them like armour. If medieval cuisine had a battle cry, it would have been, when in doubt, add more salt. If salting was medieval food armour, then smoking was medieval food perfume, assuming your idea of perfume is eau de burning wood mixed with the tears of hungry peasants. Smoking didn't just preserve meat and fish, it transformed them into smoky relics that tasted like they'd survived a house fire. Congratulations, your meat is now 20% flavour and 80% campfire trauma. And yet, people loved it, needed it, relied on it. Smoking was one of the oldest and most reliable preservation methods on Earth, and medieval Europe took full advantage of it. Why smoke was a preservation superweapon? To medieval people, smoke seemed magical. They might not have understood phenols, aldehydes, or antimicrobial compounds, but they absolutely understood. Food in smoke lasts longer. Food not in smoke betrays you. Smoke protects food in 3 major ways. 1. Drying. Smoking slowly removes moisture from meat and fish. Less moisture, less microbial joy or longer shelf life. 2. Antimicrobial chemicals. Smoke contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. In modern terms, these chemicals disrupt cell membranes and stunt reproduction. In medieval terms, bacteria see smoke and go somewhere else. 3. Insect repellent. Flies and maggots were medieval food's worst enemies. Smokehouses kept insects away because insects hated smoke almost as much as humans hated insects. Smoke didn't create invincible meals, but it did produce foods that survived storage, travel, winter, fasting periods, and children accidentally touching everything. Hot smoking versus cold smoking. Medieval people didn't categorize smoking methods the way we do today, but they used both because both worked and both produced foods that could outlive the average medieval peasant. Hot smoking cooks and preserves food at the same time. The temperature is high enough to actually heat the meat, somewhere around 120-180 degrees, 14 nice to 82 degrees. Hot smoking results, moisture decreases. Texture firms. Bacteria die dramatically. The outside develops a smoky crust. Foods were generally eaten sooner rather than later, but they still lasted far longer than fresh meat ever could. Hot smoking was perfect for pork sole, sausages, poultry, fatty fish, eels. Medieval people loved eels with a passion that cannot be explained. Hot smoking filled kitchens, sheds and smokehouses with enough smoke to make the entire village cough in sympathy. Cold smoking. Cold smoking happens at lower temperatures, around 60 to 90 degrees, 15 to 32 degrees. This doesn't cook the food, but it infuses it with smoke while slowly drying it. Cold smoking results, harder texture, stronger flavour, significantly longer storage life. Cold smoking could take days, weeks, or even months. Medieval people weren't in a hurry. Once winter came, time stopped mattering anyway. Cold smoking was ideal for bacon, ham, hard cheeses, fish like herring or cod. Anything you wanted to preserve until next season, or the next alien invasion. This method produced food so firm that you often needed a knife, axe, or personal determination to cut them. Smokehouses, where the magic and coughing happened. A smokehouse wasn't a charming rustic building. It was a dark, smoky, occasionally terrifying structure designed with one purpose: infuse meat with enough smoke to defeat bacteria and soften family grudges. Smokehouses varied widely: small household smokehouses, common on farms and rural homesteads, often made of wattle and daub. Rough stones, timber. Whatever wasn't already being used for repairs, they contained a fire pit, a few vents for airflow, hooks for hanging meat, and a constant haze so thick you could lose a relative inside. Large estate or village smokehouses. These were grander, built of stone with designated chambers and specific airflow pathways. They could smoke enormous quantities of meat at once, especially after autumn slaughter. Some monasteries maintained legendary smokehouses capable of processing tons of fish for religious fasting seasons. Smokehouse features: to work properly, the smokehouse needed low flames to produce smoke, not fire, vent control, a dirt or stone floor, overhead beams or iron hooks, a door that hopefully closed. Farmhands spent hours adding wood, adjusting airflow, and checking moisture levels while breathing enough smoke to season their lungs for winter. What they smoked, spoiler, everything. Smoking wasn't limited to meat. Medieval people smoked anything that might otherwise rot before winter ended. Meat, pork, mutton, beef, venison, boar, everything slow-dried and infused with flavour. Fish, salmon, herring, haddock, eels, cod. Smoking was essential for areas far from the sea. Cheese-hard cheeses were smoked to toughen the rind, deepen flavour, and extend longevity. Sausages. Smoked sausages were prized travel foods. They were firm, durable, and strong enough to qualify as both meal and weapon. Wood choice. The first medieval culinary debate. Different woods produced different flavours, though medieval people didn't describe flavours in poetic ways. Instead, they said things like, "This one tastes less offensive. That batch didn't make me cough as much. The ham smoked on oak didn't remind me of sadness." Common woods included oak, beech, old applewood, birch, softwoods. Like pine were avoided because they produced resin-filled smoke that tasted like someone had set fire to a church pew. Smoking and status. Smoking food wasn't just for peasants scraping through winter. Nobles smoked venison to keep hunting spoils edible. Monasteries smoked fish for fasting days. Merchants smoked goods for long-distance trade. Sailors relied on smoked fish during voyages. A well-stocked smokehouse was a sign of a well-organised household, the medieval equivalent of having a walk-in freezer. In the end, smoke was power. Smoking was more than a practical solution. It was a culinary transformation. It turned vulnerable meat into durable food. It turned fragile fish into long-lasting commodities. It allowed households to plan, merchants to travel, monasteries to feed armies of monks, and villages to survive unforgiving winters. Medieval cooking fires warmed homes, smokehouses fed them, and every smoke-filled room whispered the same truth. Your food will last longer than your nerves. If smoking was medieval food therapy and salting was medieval embalming, then drying was medieval asceticism. Drying didn't add flavour, it didn't make food sturdier in a pleasant way. It didn't improve texture unless your idea of texture is edible wood. Drying stripped food down to its existential core, the thing it used to be, minus the water, joy and softness. Yet for all its emotional brutality, drying was one of the simplest and most reliable ways to keep food edible without modern tools. It required no expensive ingredients, no elaborate structures, no complicated rituals, just time, air and surrender. And perhaps a strong jaw, because dried cod was famously so tough that sailors used it as both a weapon and a dinner. Why drying worked. Medieval science. 101. Water is life, for both humans and bacteria. Remove moisture, and bacteria give up, pack their microscopic bags, and go haunt someone else's pantry. Drying food slows or stops. Spoilage reduces weight, makes transport easier, shrinks food down to its concentrated, slightly sad essence. Medieval people didn't explain it that way, of course. Their understanding of drying sounded more like, if it's dry, it doesn't rot, therefore dry everything. The method was ancient, universal, affordable and effective, which meant that if you lived in the Middle Ages, you encountered dried food constantly. Whether you liked it or not, you didn't. Air drying, the let nature do all the work method. Air drying was the most common because it was the easiest. You simply hung food somewhere breezy and waited until it turned into a lighter, tougher version of itself, but the location mattered a lot. 1. Indoors, the beam and rafter method. Inside a medieval home, rafters above the hearth became prime drying real estate. These rafters were warm, smoky, and out of reach of curious animals, and occasionally children. You could find herbs tied in bundles, onions braided and hung like edible chandeliers, strips of meat dangling ominously, apples sliced and strung like prehistoric Christmas ornaments. Indoor drying took advantage of rising heat, which dehydrated food without cooking it. The smoke in the room, constant from open fireplaces, also discouraged insects, and possibly guests, if the smell was intense enough. 2. Outdoors, the wind and sun partnership. Outdoor drying platforms and racks were common in places with predictable weather. Wind-rich regions like Scandinavia, Scotland and northern Germany perfected air-drying fish, transforming fresh catch into rigid slabs of survival protein. Nothing said prosperous household like a yard decorated with drying fish that resembled stiff, leathery flags flapping in the breeze. 3. Elevated platforms. To keep food away from dogs, rodents, chickens, bored children, people built raised racks or hung food high above the ground using poles, hooks or scaffolds. This also allowed breezes to circulate fully around the food. Was air-dried food pretty? No. Did it work? Absolutely. Sun-drying. When the weather signed the permission slip. Sun-drying required one major thing medieval Europe didn't always offer: consistent sunshine. But in warmer, drier climates, or during hot summers, sun-drying was a perfect, cost-free method. Food laid out on cloth, boards, or basket absorbed heat and lost moisture quickly. What people sun-dried? Fruits, plums, apples, cherries, figs, grains and legumes before storage, nuts, bread cubes to become trenchers or rehydrated later, some vegetables, fruit in particular loved sun-drying. Dried apples and plums became portable snacks or winter treats. Medieval children cherished dried fruits the way modern children cherish candy. And because dried fruit tasted sweet, nutritious, and not like salted suffering, it was considered a luxury in lean seasons. But sun-drying wasn't without risks. It required no rain, no surprise storms, no insects, no birds, no neighbour's goat, wandering over and committing snack theft. Success depended on vigilance. Food might be brought inside at night, covered hastily during rain, or moved repeatedly to chase sunlight like medieval solar panels. Kiln drying, the controlled climate approach. Where climate failed, kilns stepped in. Kiln drying wasn't glamorous, but it was more reliable than air or sun. What exactly was kiln drying? A kiln or oven was heated gently, not enough to cook food, but enough to warm the air and draw moisture out. Some kilns had separate chambers for drying where heat filtered indirectly. Others used residual heat from baking ovens. Kiln drying worked particularly well for grains, especially barley and oats, malt for brewing certain fruits, small fish strips of meat. Because kilns had mostly controlled heat, they were ideal for regions with unpredictable weather. Kiln dangers and drama. Kilns pose certain risks, such as scorching food, uneven drying, igniting, hanging herbs, accidental cooking, creating smells so strange they confused everyone. But despite these hazards, kilns offered consistency. And consistency was rare enough to be prized. What medieval people dried besides their patience? 1. Meat-dried beef, venison, goat and pork could last months. It wasn't juicy, it wasn't exciting, but if you boiled it long enough it became edible. 2. Fish. Fish was the superstar of dried foods, especially cod. Dried cod was so tough sailors used it as a weapon and a dinner. Travel journals describe sailors breaking it against the ship rail to soften it. Others soaked it for days before cooking. But its durability made it essential for long voyages and winter diets. 3. Fruits and vegetables. Sliced apples, plums, pears, and even carrots or peas could be dried for soups and stews. Fruit drying was especially popular in monasteries and wealthier households. 4. Herbs. Drying herbs was crucial for medieval medicine, cooking, brewing, and magic, depending on your local witchcraft bylaws. The flavour, or lack thereof. Let's address the taste question. Dried food was chewy, sometimes brittle, often bland, occasionally alarming. But it was safe, and that was the point. Medieval cuisine wasn't about delighting the palate, it was about surviving the winter without resorting to biting your boots. Dried food could be rehydrated in stews, ground into powder mixed with grains, or simply gnawed on with determination. The great advantage: durability. Dried food could last months or even years, travel long distances, resist spoilage stack, neatly be stored in bags, barrels, or hanging networks. Drying was the medieval equivalent of storing files in the cloud, lightweight, preserved, and ready whenever needed. In the end, drying was simplicity at its best. No smoke, no salt, no underground construction, just air, sunlight, warmth, and patience. Drying turned perishable ingredients into medieval survival rations. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't delicious, and it definitely wasn't tender, but it kept people alive through seasons when nothing grew and hope ran thin. And that made dried food priceless. If drying was medieval austerity and smoking was medieval aromatherapy, then pickling was medieval chemistry, messy, smelly, miraculous, and sometimes slightly terrifying. Pickling turned questionable vegetables, precarious fish, and nearly expired hope into foods that could survive months, sometimes years, But pickling didn't just preserve food, it preserved your regrets, because once you tasted medieval pickled herring, your regrets were definitely preserved. Why pickling worked? The acid advantage. Pickling relies on two powerful preservation forces. One, vinegar acidic enough to make bacteria second-guess their life choices. Two, brine, a saltwater solution that encouraged beneficial fermentation while discouraging anything with harmful intentions. Whether the method involved drowning food in vinegar or letting it ferment in brine, the result was a harsh, tangy, long-lasting product that could withstand storage, winter, travel, and medieval cooking fires. Pickling didn't require perfect weather, expensive tools, or constant attention. It required a container, enough liquid to submerge food, patience, low expectations, and the occasional prayer that whatever was bubbling inside the barrel was supposed to bubble. Vinegar. Pickling, the acidic bodyguard. Vinegar was one of the Middle Ages' most valuable household substances. It cleaned wounds, made sauces, helped with laundry, removed stains, acted as questionable medicine, and preserved food like a champion. What got vinegar pickled? Nearly anything that fit inside a jar. Onions, cucumbers? Yes, pickles existed long before hipsters rediscovered them. Garlic fennel, turnips, carrots, herbs, fruits like pears or plums, fish, especially in Northern Europe. Vinegar created an acidic environment bacteria couldn't tolerate. Medieval people didn't understand pH levels, but they understood that food in vinegar stays food. Food out of vinegar becomes trouble. How vinegar was made vinegar wasn't purchased at a store. It was the result of nature's persistence. Wine, cider, or beer that went bad didn't become useless. It became vinegar. Medieval households often had a permanent pot of souring liquid tucked in a corner, growing the mother, a slimy, jelly-like mass that terrified children and fascinated cooks. When wine spoiled, medieval people didn't mourn. They said, "Excellent, now we can pickle something." Brine. Pickling. The fermented frontier. Brine pickling was different. Instead of drowning food in vinegar, you drowned it in a saltwater solution strong enough to make snails weep. Over time, beneficial bacteria created lactic acid, transforming the food into something sour, tangy, and surprisingly durable. This method was particularly common among those who couldn't afford large quantities of vinegar, wanted mild acidity, loved fermentation, or had no choice because everything around them was fermenting anyway. What went into brine? Cabbage. Hello, proto-sauerkraut. Beets, carrots, leeks, beans, peas, green herbs, eggs. Yes, pickled eggs have a long and suspicious history. Brine pickling was perfect for regions with long winters because it kept vegetables edible without requiring heat, sunlight, or constant supervision. Fermented vegetables, medieval probiotics, whether you wanted them or not. Fermented vegetables arose naturally in areas where people stored produce in crocks or barrels and noticed certain batches survived longer and tasted, well, different. Cabbage was the superstar. In Germanic lands, it was shredded, salted, packed tight, and allowed to ferment until it transformed into sauerkraut, the crunchy, sour, vitamin-saving miracle of winter. Fermented vegetables weren't just preserved, they improved nutrition. They supplied vitamin C, preventing scurvy, probiotics, though medieval people didn't know that word, fibre. A break from the monotony of dried and salted everything. Fermentation also produced smells ranging from pleasantly tangy to "who opened the gates of sulphur?" A good crock of fermented cabbage had a scent strong enough to remind the household that life was short and aroma was subjective. Pickled fish, the boldest decision medieval people ever made. Pickled fish was a staple from Scandinavia to Eastern Europe. Fish was perishable, plentiful, and fast to spoil. Pickling was the only consistent way to keep it edible for long periods, especially far inland. There were two main methods. 1. Vinegar brined fish. Often combined with onions, spices or herbs, this produced something sharp, fishy and eye-watering. 2. Fully fermented fish. This is the version that makes modern noses weak. Fish layered with salt, weighed down with stones, and left to ferment until it turned into an aromatic paste or jelly-like mass. To medieval eaters, this was normal. To modern eaters, this is trauma. Pickled fish lasted through the winter, survived long journeys, and made fasting days bearable, or at least survivable. Pickling vessels, the jars of destiny. Pickling required sturdy containers. These included clay jars, glazed pottery, wooden barrels, stoneware crocks, glassed in wealthy households. A good seal was essential. People used waxcloth, wooden lids, leather covers, mud or clay around the rim, anything to keep air out and acid in. Inside these jars and barrels, entire microscopic worlds formed. Vegetables softened, fish transformed, brine clouded, and bubbles rose slowly like a medieval brewing cauldron, except instead of beer, it was the world's sourest cabbage. Pickling spices, the medieval flavour upgrade. Pickling didn't have to taste like punishment. Spices could be added when available. Dill, mustard seeds, bay leaves, pepper, juniper berries, cloves, coriander. These spices helped mask off flavours and provided a pleasant complexity, something medieval palates deeply appreciated in the middle of winter boredom. Seasonal dependence and why pickling was essential. Pickling peaked in late summer, when produce flooded markets and gardens, autumn, when fish were abundant and vegetables needed long-term storage, pre-winter panic season, when people realised they were not emotionally prepared for another 6 months of root vegetables, pickled foods became winter heroes, offering acidity, variety, and psychological relief. After months of bland grains and dried things, a sharp bite of pickled carrot tasted like hope. In the end, pickling was medieval alchemy. Pickling transformed perishable ingredients into powerful, long-lasting, intensely flavoured staples. It required no magic, just acid, time, and containers strong enough to hold the chaos. Medieval people didn't have refrigerators. They had barrels of bubbling cabbage, jars of sour onions, crocks of brined carrots, and fish that had been submerged so long it probably forgot it ever lived in the sea. And through this acidic alchemy they survived. If there was ever a moment in history when microbes became the heroes of human survival, it was the medieval era. Fermentation was the Middle Ages' grand scientific achievement, performed entirely by people who had no idea what science was. They didn't understand yeast, bacteria, or the microbiological ballet happening inside their barrels and crocks. But they understood one thing with absolute clarity. If it bubbled, fizzed, or hissed, people said, "Perfect, dinner is ready." Fermentation wasn't just a food technique. It was a lifestyle, a preservative, a nutritional upgrade, a flavour generator, and sometimes an accidental experiment gone right, or very, very wrong. Medieval fermentation fed villages, hydrated armies, comforted labourers, enriched monasteries, and, let's be honest, made peasant life significantly more tolerable. Why fermentation worked. Medieval magic, modern microbiology. To medieval people, fermentation was a kind of blessed process that happened naturally if you left the right food in the right place for the right amount of time. They saw it as the work of living spirits, a gift from God, or a sign that the food was awakening. They weren't wrong. Microbes were awakening, just not in ways medieval people could explain. In modern terms, fermentation works because good bacteria or yeasts eat sugars, produce alcohol, acids or gases, which preserve food, create new flavours, and keep harmful microbes away. In medieval terms, fermentation works because the jar made noises and now we can drink it without dying. Bread, the accidental miracle. Bread is the cornerstone of medieval diets, and leavened bread is the cornerstone of controlled rot because yeast is very much alive and extremely busy. How bread fermentation worked. Medieval bakers didn't buy yeast packets. They relied on sourdough-style starters, fermenting mixtures of flour and water colonized by wild yeasts. A good starter was a treasured family heirloom, passed down through generations like a culinary spell. If it smelled sharp, bubbled, or behaved like a small pet, bakers took it as a good sign. Why fermented bread was important. Leavened bread. Rose became airy-tasted complex, provided better nutrition, digested more easily. Without fermentation, medieval bread would have been a brick, and people already had enough bricks. Yet a baking mishap might result in over-fermented dough, under-fermented dough that wandered off the table, entirely dough that hissed ominously. All normal, because fermentation is messy, delicious, life-saving and messy. Beer. The medieval hydration strategy. Water was often contaminated, so medieval people turned to beer, the safe, tasty, morale-boosting beverage that kept villagers working, monks thriving, and children slightly tipsy. Fermentation turned grain into liquid gold, or liquid beige, at least. How beer was made malted. Barley. Fermented grain to activate enzymes. Boiled water. Ale yeast. Open vats. Weeks of waiting. Occasional prayer. Occasional accidental explosions. Alehouses brewed endlessly. Monasteries perfected the craft. Households brewed their own small beer, low alcohol, safe for daily drinking, and suitable even for children. Why beer? Mattered was a calorie source, a safe water substitute, a daily drink, a preservable liquid, a social glue. You could store it longer than plain grain and longer than fresh water, making it both food and preservative. Wine, controlled rot for the upper classes. While beer was universal, wine was regional, produced in warmer climates where vineyards thrived. Wine was fermented grape juice that magically transformed into a beverage that could be stored for months or years. Medieval vintners didn't understand yeast, but they definitely understood the importance of clean barrels, proper, crushing, keeping insects away, waiting patiently, not panicking when the wine foamed aggressively. Wine fermentation created alcohol and acidity, both powerful protectors against spoilage. Wine in medieval life. Monks produced huge quantities for liturgy and sale. Nobles displayed vintages as status symbols. Merchants transported wine across Europe. Peasants got whatever was left over, which usually tasted like resentment and vinegar. Cheese, milk's glorious transformation. Cheese was, in many ways, the crown jewel of medieval fermentation. Fresh milk spoiled in hours. Fermented milk lasted for months. That's the whole story, and it saved lives. How cheese was made. Cheese began with curdling milk using rennet, acidic whey vinegar, or simply thyme. Curds were drained, salted, pressed, aged, and transformed into a miracle food that was high in fat, high in protein, portable, durable, delicious. Most of the time, cheese aging rooms were full of wheels in various stages of microbial enchantment. Some cheeses became hard enough to survive entire winters, some became soft enough to slide off shelves, some developed personalities. Cheese varieties medieval society enjoyed. Soft cheeses for immediate eating, hard-aged cheeses for travel, blue-ish cheeses that monks insisted were perfectly safe, stinky cheeses that terrified visitors. Cheese was proof that fermentation could create something wonderful rather than something questionable. Vegetable fermentation, the forgotten ally. While pickling in vinegar was common, true fermentation offered deeper transformation. Fermented vegetables provided probiotics, acidity, fresh flavours during winter improved digestion, an excuse to poke barrels and ask, is this supposed to look like that? Cabbage, turnips and carrots were often fermented in salt brine, creating tangy, crunchy, life-saving dishes. Fermented sauces and pastes, the medieval umami. Across Europe, fermented sauces were treasured. They tasted salty, complex, pungent, slightly alarming, but they enhanced stews, porridges, and meats. Versions included fermented fish sauces, similar to Roman garum, fermented herb paste, sour grain porridges, fermented dairy condiments. These sauces allowed simple meals to become deeply flavourful. Accidental fermentation, medieval edition. Because fermentation was everywhere, medieval people often stumbled into it unintentionally. If something hissed, bubbled, foamed, expanded, or tried to climb out of its jar, the medieval reaction was usually, "Ah yes, fermentation." Sometimes this was correct. Sometimes they had accidentally invented a new food. Sometimes they had accidentally invented regret. But overall, fermentation produced more blessings than disasters. In the end, fermentation was medieval alchemy. Fermentation turned grain into beer milk, into cheese grapes, into wine dough, into bread vegetables, into winter hope. It was a partnership between humans and microbes, a relationship medieval people didn't understand but trusted with their entire stomachs. Fermentation didn't just preserve food, it elevated it. It made food safer, tastier, and more nutritious. And in a world without refrigerators, freezing, or modern science, the fact that something could fizz or hiss and still be edible felt nothing short of miraculous. If you were a medieval cook trying to keep food edible, you had a handful of weapons: salt, smoke, vinegar, cold air, and the deepest magic of them all, honey, the sticky golden miracle that worked as medicine, sweetener, currency, and occasionally a food sarcophagus. Honey wasn't just precious because it tasted good. It was precious because it didn't spoil, ever. Archaeologists have opened 3,000-year-old jars of honey and found it still perfectly edible. If you're brave enough to eat something older than most civilizations, so in the Middle Ages, honey wasn't just a treat. It was the sweet glue of survival. If you submerged food in honey, that food stayed edible for ages, though whether you wanted to eat honey mummified chicken is another question entirely. Why honey? Works. Nature's antibacterial superpower. If medieval people had known chemistry, they would have worshipped honey on purpose instead of by accident. Modern science explains honey's preservation magic through several key traits. 1. Low water content. Honey is thick, dense, and extremely low in available moisture, which means bacteria can't survive in it. The moment microbes enter honey, they shrivel like raisins at a beach party. 2. High sugar concentration. The sugar binds whatever tiny bit of water is available, leaving none for bacterial freeloaders. 3. Acidity. Honey naturally has a low pH. Not quite vinegar-level acidic, but acidic enough to make bacteria deeply uncomfortable. 4. Hydrogen peroxide production. Yes, honey literally produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide when diluted. Medieval people didn't know this, but they definitely knew honey could heal wounds and keep fruit from rotting. Together, these traits made honey the closest thing medieval kitchens had to a magical force field. To medieval cooks, the explanation was simpler. Honey is blessed. Put everything in honey. Honey preserved fruits, the original medieval candy. Before sugar became widespread in Europe, honey was the primary sweetener, and it didn't just sweeten meals, it saved them. Fruit in honey syrups. Medieval cooks preserved pears, figs, quinces, apples, plums, cherries, citrus if imported. Sliced fruit was boiled gently in honey, or layered raw in a jar and completely submerged. What resulted was soft, fragrant sweet, extremely shelf-stable. These honey fruits became winter luxuries, served to guests, monarchs, or anyone you wanted to impress with your ability to hoard good food like a medieval squirrel. Candied fruit, comfits. By repeatedly soaking fruit in honey, or later sugar syrup, medieval confectioners created early candied fruits, sticky jewel-like treats that could last months. Noble banquets served these as fancy subtleties, delicate desserts meant to show off wealth. In short, honey transformed fruit from fragile summer delicacy into preserved treasure. Honey-preserved nuts, medieval energy bars. Fruits weren't the only things honey saved. Medieval households routinely stored nuts in honey jars. Popular. Nuts. Preserved in honey, walnuts, hazelnuts, almonds, pine nuts. When submerged, nuts stayed fresh far longer, and the combination created a portable, calorie-dense snack, perfect for long journeys, winter months, and times when you needed food that could survive backpack travel, poor roads, and medieval weather tantrums. Honeyed nuts were the medieval version of trail mix, except stickier and infinitely more delicious. Meat in honey, the textural enigma. Now we come to the strangest but historically real part of honey preservation. Meat. Yes, medieval cooks preserved meat in honey, not because it tasted great, not because it was fashionable, but because it worked. How it was done. Small cuts of meat were cooked or partly cooked, cooled, fully submerged in honey, stored in a sealed ceramic jar. Honey prevented spoilage by creating an oxygen-free environment hostile to bacteria. The result, technically edible, nutritionally dense, safe to store for months. But the texture? Let's just say chicken preserved in honey probably had the consistency of an apology. This wasn't everyday food, it was long-term emergency rations for travellers, monks, or wealthy households preparing for uncertain winters. Honey mummified meat wasn't a gourmet choice. It was insurance against starvation. Medicinal preserves, food or medicine? Yes, honey was so valued in medieval medicine that many preserved foods doubled as remedies. Examples: ginger in honey for digestion, garlic in honey for infections, fennel seeds in the honey for cough, rose petals in honey for luxury and emotional wellness. Medieval households used honey-preserved foods both for flavour and healing. A spoonful of honey fruit could soothe a sore throat. Honeyed herbs could treat seasonal illnesses. It was the medieval pharmacy shelf, sweet, sticky, and surprisingly effective. Mead, honey's fermented cousin. While fermentation was covered in a previous chapter, honey deserves a brief cameo here, because medieval people didn't only store food in honey, they turned honey into alcohol. Mead, brewed from honey, water, and yeast, was beloved across Europe. Fermentation transformed honey from preservative into beverage, proving honey was the most versatile food substance in medieval life. Honey preserved food, honey made medicine, honey made alcohol, honey had range. Why? Honey preservation was a luxury. Unlike salt or smoke, honey wasn't available everywhere in huge quantities. Beekeeping was laborious, risky, and occasionally ridiculous. Beekeepers fought, wild bees hive thieves, bears cold snaps, bee stings, honey, fermentation gone wrong. Honeycombs were hard-won treasures, and their value made honey-preserved food status symbols. The poorest households rarely used honey for preservation. The wealthiest households did it proudly. Monasteries did it methodically. Merchants sold honey-preserved delicacies to noble court. Honey wasn't just food, it was wealth in edible form. In the end, honey was sweet soul. Survival. Honey preservation was one of the most elegant solutions medieval people had. It required no salt, no smoke, no barrels, no cellars, just bees, patience, and jars sturdy enough to contain sticky immortality. Honey kept fruits luscious, nuts delicious, and meats disturbingly well preserved. It created treats, medicines, and emergency food supplies. Food stored in honey stayed edible for ages. Whether you wanted to eat honey mummified chicken is another question. But medieval survival didn't hinge on preference. It hinged on ingenuity, and honey was one of the Middle Ages' sweetest strokes of genius. If honey was medieval sweet glue, then fat was medieval cement, opaque, heavy, suffocating, and remarkably good at keeping things hidden. People in the Middle Ages didn't have plastic wrap, vacuum sealers, or airtight Tupperware, so they used the next best thing, solidified animal fat. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't elegant, it wasn't even visually reassuring. Imagine opening a jar and finding your dinner entombed in a pale, wobbly layer of grease. But in a world where oxygen was the enemy of freshness, fat preservation was a stroke of genius. Medieval people stored meat in fat the way we store trauma, deep down, never exposed to oxygen. Why fat preservation worked? The Great Oxygen Ban. When food spoils, it's usually because bacteria, mold, or yeasts invade and throw a microscopic party. Most of these intruders need oxygen, so medieval cooks figured out a brilliantly simple solution. If bacteria need air, don't give them any. Fat, whether from pigs, cows, geese, or sheep, solidifies at cool temperatures and forms a seal that is airtight, moisture-resistant, difficult for insects to breach, confusing to anyone expecting appetizing presentation. This seal, when applied correctly, trapped food in a low-oxygen bubble, where spoilage slowed dramatically. The method wasn't foolproof, but when maintained properly, it kept food safe for weeks, months, or in some cases, miraculously, until the next season. Confit. The culinary side of preservation. Though the word confit is French, the idea existed in many cultures. Cook meat slowly in its own fat, then store it under a protective layer of that fat. How it worked meat, often goose, duck or pork, was salted to draw out moisture. It was then simmered gently and rendered fat until fully cooked. Once cooled, the meat was placed in a pot. Melted fat was poured over it, sealing every crack and crevice. The pot was stored in a cool room, pantry or cellar. As long as the fat cap remained sealed and intact, the meat stayed safe. What it produced? Tender, flavourful meat that could be reheated, shredded, stewed or grilled weeks later. Unlike many medieval preservation methods, confit actually tasted good, really good. It's one of the few medieval techniques still beloved today by gourmet chefs. But for medieval people, confit wasn't fancy. It was survival wrapped in deliciousness. Potted meat. The fat jars of doom. Potted meat was a cousin of confit, but where confit was about slow cooking, potted meat was about shoving cooked or leftover meat into a jar and burying it in fat like a culinary time capsule. The processed cooked meat was shredded or chopped. Seasonings like pepper, cloves, nutmeg or mace were added, if you had money. Everything was packed tightly into a clay pot or ceramic jar. Hot, melted fat, usually lard or dripping, was poured over the top. The jar was sealed with a cloth, lid or wax. It was stored somewhere cool and dark. When done well, potted meat could last for months. When done poorly, it was a biological experiment. The flavour experience. Potted meat varied wildly. Rich and savoury in wealthy homes, oily and salty in peasant homes, occasionally mysterious in every home. It was a versatile emergency ration, spread on bread, added to stews, or eaten straight from the pot by hungry people who didn't have time for utensils. Don't judge. Oil preservation, the Mediterranean upgrade. In southern Europe, where olive trees were abundant and winters less harsh, and households relied more on oil than solid fats. Oil didn't solidify like lard or tallow, but it still sealed food from air and slowed spoilage. Mediterranean cooks used oil to preserve herbs, garlic, cheese, vegetables, small fish, cooked meats, occasionally medicinal ingredients. Olive oil was the star. Olive oil created a smooth, aromatic barrier that protected food while imparting a subtle flavour. It lacked the full air tightness of solid fat, but it worked well, especially when combined with herbs, vinegar or salt. Cheese stored in oil became softer, more complex and wonderfully spreadable. Herbs steeped in oil became early infused oils. However, oil preservation required clean containers, cool, dark storage, high-quality oil, regular inspection. So while its flavour was superior, its reliability varied. Regional variations in fat preservation. Different climates and animal resources shape the preservation landscape. Northern Europe, lard, dripping, tallow, goose fat, confit-style storage, potted meats for winter months, large ceramic jars in cool cellars, Mediterranean regions, olive oil, storage oil-preserved fish, like anchovies, herbs and cheeses covered in oil, clay amphorae used for long-term storage. Eastern Europe, heavy use of lard, potted pork and beef, preserved sausages sealed with fat, fat caps on stews and soups kept leftovers safe longer. In every region, fat preservation wasn't just technique, it was tradition. Containers, the fat coffins of medieval kitchens. To preserve food in fat, you needed containers that could withstand heat, grease, pressure, time, gravity, and nosy animals. Common containers included glazed pottery jars, ceramic crocks, stoneware pots sealed, wooden tubs, glass jars rare and expensive. These jars often sat on pantry shelves or buried partially in the ground. When opened, the fat layer had to be sliced or cracked like an edible ice cap. If the fat seal looked smooth and clean, cooks rejoiced. If it looked cracked, mouldy or uneven, dinner was cancelled. Fat preservation and social status. Fat was valuable. It came from livestock, and livestock were costly to feed. This meant wealthy households preserved delicacies in fat, middle households preserved leftovers. Poor households rarely had enough fat to preserve anything. It was too precious to waste. In wealthier manors, pots of preserved duck, goose, and pork lined shelves like trophies. In peasant homes, fat was stretched thinly across cooking, lighting, and food preservation, making it more precious than spices. The downsides. Let's talk about texture. Meat stored in fat was undeniably effective, but the texture could be unpredictable. Depending on temperature and handling, it might be tender, it might be gelatinous, it might be stringy, it might be overwhelmingly greasy, and it might taste like a cross between butter and regret. But food in fat was food that survived winter, and survival always outweighed culinary perfection. In the end, fat was medieval airlock technology. Fat preservation was both crude and brilliant. It harnessed a simple principle, deny oxygen, deny spoilage, and turned it into a reliable tool for societies without refrigeration. Confit showcased culinary finesse. Potted meat showcased practicality. Oil preservation showcased elegance. Fat jars showcased determination. Medieval people stored meat in fat the way we store trauma, deep down, never exposed to oxygen. And thanks to that, countless families made it through cold months with full bellies and jars of greasy, glorious survival food. If medieval life had a mascot food, something sturdy, reliable, quietly powerful, and capable of doubling as both nourishment and weaponry, it was hard cheese. Unlike soft cheeses that had all the emotional stability of fresh milk, hard cheeses were built for conflict. Conflict with time, conflict with bacteria, conflict with winter, and occasionally conflict with anyone who broke into your pantry. Some cheeses were so old and hard they doubled as self-defense weapons. And considering how some medieval roads were, this was a reasonable feature. Hard cheese wasn't just food, it was insurance, a compact, portable, durable brick of protein and fat that stayed edible long after other foods had surrendered to decay. Why cheese was a medieval lifeline. Cheese solved a fundamental medieval problem. Milk spoiled in hours. Cheese spoiled in months or years. Milk was fragile. Cheese was immortal. Milk was a bad roommate. Cheese was the calm, reliable friend who helped you move. And crucially, cheese condensed calories into a dense form that survived travel, trade, and storage. Where dairy existed, cheese existed. From alpine chalets to English monasteries, from village dairies to noble estates, cheese was a universal survival tool. How hard cheese was made, aging, nature's slow-motion magic trick. Hard cheese began like any cheese. Fresh milk was warmed. Rennet or acidic whey caused it to curdle. Curds were cut, drained, and pressed. But the transformation into a rock-hard nutritional miracle came from what happened next. 1. Salting the curds. Salt was rubbed on the surface, mixed into curds or used in brine baths. Salt pulled out moisture, prevented unwanted bacteria, strengthened the rind, encouraged beneficial microbes. Salt was the first line of defense, the cheese equivalent of medieval chainmail. 2. Pressing out moisture. Hard cheeses were pressed for hours or days. Some presses weighed hundreds of pounds or used elaborate lever systems. The more liquid squeezed out, the longer the cheese could last. Low moisture is low spoilage. The drier the cheese, the longer it survived. 3. Aging, or letting time do something useful for once. Aging rooms, called cheese caves or cellars, were cool, dark and stacked with wheels of slowly maturing cheese. Inside each wheel, bacteria worked their microscopic magic, turning curds into dense, complex-flavoured, long-lasting nutrition. Aging created firm texture, sharp flavour, hardened the ability to survive generations. Some medieval cheeses aged for months, some aged for years, some aged so long that biting into them risked dental regret. The science of stability, medieval style. Hard cheese lasted because 1. It was dry moisture, fuels, mould and bacteria. A hard cheese was basically the Sahara in dairy form. 2. It was salty, salt discouraged microbial freeloaders. 3. It had good bacteria. Beneficial microbes claimed territory early, leaving no room for harmful ones. Medieval people didn't know this, but they definitely knew that. This cheese keeps well. This cheese does not. This cheese tried to kill me. 4. It had a protective rind. Rinds formed naturally during aging. They were tough, thick, and occasionally terrifying. Some were so durable they could withstand storage, travel, shipping, and being accidentally dropped down a flight of stairs. The rind protected the interior like a medieval castle wall, rough, defensive, sometimes full of cracks, but undeniably effective. Cheese as a travel companion. Hard cheese was essential for travellers, merchants, armies, sailors, shepherds, pilgrims, basically anyone leaving home for more than 3 hours. It didn't rot, it didn't melt, it didn't complain, it didn't require cooking, it didn't require utensils. You just cut off a chunk with a knife or axe, depending on hardness, and ate it with bread. Travel narratives across medieval Europe mention cheese as a staple journey in food. Pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela carried cheese wheels. Soldiers marching to war carried cheese in their packs. Explorers loaded ships with cheese because it endured sea voyages without becoming a biohazard. Cheese was the original power bar, dense, nutritious, and occasionally violent if dropped. Cheese in monasteries, where dairy became devotion. Monasteries were the great dairy laboratories of medieval Europe. They kept cows, goats, and sheep. They perfected cheese recipes. They documented methods, and they aged cheeses and carefully maintained cellars. Monastic cheeses became famous. Alpine Swiss-style cheeses, early forms of Parmesan English hard cheeses, French mountain varieties. These cheeses weren't just for monks. They were sold, traded, gifted to nobles, and used to support monastic communities. Some monks even used cheese wheels as rent payments, which is arguably the most delicious form of taxation ever invented. The many forms of hard cheese medieval Europe wasn't eating cheddar and parmesan as we know them today, but they had ancestors of these cheeses, robust, long-aged, and firm enough to survive climate swings. Examples included Granary cheeses, Italy, hard, grainy cheeses like the ancestors of modern Parmigiano Reggiano, aged for years, nearly indestructible, perfect for grating over everything. Alpine cheeses, Switzerland and France, large wheels, aged in mountain caves, often forming ultra-tough rinds. English hard cheeses, firm cow's milk cheeses that travelled well and stored beautifully. Goat and sheep. Hard cheeses, smaller wheels, sharp flavour, used in harsher climates, where cows were impractical. These cheeses varied in taste but shared 3 traits: dry, durable, dependable. In a world where food died fast, cheese lived long, how people used hard cheese. Hard cheese wasn't usually eaten in thick slices, unless you had heroic teeth. Instead, medieval cooks grated it into porridge, shaved it over vegetables, melted it into sauces, added it to pies, ate small chunks with bread, carried it as emergency rations. Hard cheese provided fat, protein, calcium and calories in compact form. It made everything taste better, especially winter food, which often needed help. The weaponry potential entirely accidentally intended. Let's be honest, some medieval hard cheeses were intense. Aged for so long they became harder than stone, dense enough to be used as improvised hammers, heavy enough to dent a helmet if thrown with enthusiasm. It's entirely plausible that a late-aged cheese wheel could double as a mace in emergencies. No medieval household chronicle says this explicitly, but we can read between the lines. In the end, hard cheese was medieval longevity in edible form. Hard cheese was durable, portable, nutritious, long-lasting, trade-friendly, battle-ready. Intentionally or not, it survived storage, it survived winter, it survived travel, and it definitely survived attempts to cut it with anything less than a determined hand and a sharp knife. In a world where food turned on you quickly, though, hard cheese stood firm, literally. Cheese was the medieval insurance policy you could eat, and sometimes use for self-defense. Medieval cooks had many ways to keep food edible, but when those methods failed, or when the food had simply been alive far too long, they turned to one last glorious trick: spice it until nobody could tell how old it was. Spices didn't preserve food, and they certainly didn't reverse decay, but they did offer something invaluable in a world where expiration dates were more of a dream than a guideline. They offered distraction. If the meat smelled questionable, just add more cinnamon. Problem solved, nose ignored. In an era without refrigeration, spices were the medieval equivalent of sweeping a problem under a rug and pretending everything looked great. Spices were prized not for their ability to stop spoilage, but for their power to wage psychological warfare against the senses. Medieval cooks weren't fools. They knew old food tasted, lived in. They also knew spices had the uncanny ability to transform that lived-in taste into something exotic, surprising, or at the very least confusing enough that diners couldn't immediately identify the problem. In fact, spices were so valuable that their presence in a dish signified wealth, sophistication, and perhaps a quiet admission that the meat was in its twilight years. Many spices came from regions unimaginably far away, transported across deserts, mountains and seas. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, ginger from Southeast Asia, cloves from Indonesia. Each spice took a heroic journey worthy of an epic poem. By the time they reached European markets, they were expensive enough to be kept under lock and key, and yet medieval cooks used them liberally when they needed to disguise culinary sins. Rich households especially enjoyed proving they could afford such extravagance, even if it meant using 4 kinds of spice to mask the flavour of a chicken that had clearly been negotiating with bacteria. The most popular spice of all was pepper, so universally loved that people considered it a form of money. Pepper went into everything: meat stews, fish sauces, pies, wine, pastries, medicinal tonics, and probably a few dishes that never should have met pepper in the first place. Pepper added heat and sharpness, overwhelming the senses and bravely covering up hints of age. Medieval cooks understood this well. If the chicken tasted vintage, pepper was the first line of defense, the aromatic soldier marching straight into battle with decay. Cinnamon was another favorite, and not just for sweet dishes. Medieval cooks used cinnamon the way we use garlic, excessively and without warning. Meat pies, stews, sauces, roasts, porridges, pastries, broths. Everything could be enhanced or disguised with a generous handful of cinnamon. Its warm, woody aroma wrapped aging flavours in a comforting cloud of denial. There are medieval recipes that read less like cooking instructions and more like panic in spice form. Take thy beef and add cinnamon, ginger, saffron, cloves, and more cinnamon. Translation: This beef is suspicious, fix it with everything in the spice drawer. Cloves and nutmeg added complexity to dishes that desperately needed it. Both spices were potent enough to overpower flavours, aromas, and unfortunate textures. If meat tasted slightly gamey, a medieval euphemism for this animal passed away days before you cooked it, cloves marched in like a one-spice rescue squad. Nutmeg's intense aroma could turn a dish from worrying to festive faster than diners could question what the meat used to be. Ginger, treasured for its heat and its ability to liven up dull dishes, performed similar service. When cooks reached for ginger, it was usually because the food was edible but needed immediate personality. The wealthy embraced spices so enthusiastically that recipes sometimes looked like spice catalogues with meat as an afterthought. Medieval aristocrats weren't just trying to hide flavours, they were performing culinary theatre. A dish bursting with saffron, pepper, ginger and cloves wasn't just tasty or functional. It was a flex, a declaration, a way of saying I'm wealthy enough to overwhelm your senses for entertainment. Spices became synonymous with elite dining, so much so that guests praised dishes not for the food itself, but for how aggressively spiced they were. Medieval cuisine sometimes resembled a competitive sport in which the winner was whoever could afford to use enough spice to stun their guests into silence. Meanwhile, the poor rarely encountered expensive spices. Their food might get flavoured with local herbs, mustard seeds or onions, but cinnamon, pepper and cloves remained symbols of wealth. Still, even modest households occasionally splurged on a pinch of something fragrant during festivals or holidays, transforming an otherwise humble pot of stew into something memorable. These small moments of indulgence meant everything in a life filled with labour and repetition. A bit of spice could make a simple meal feel like a gift. Another reason spices were so beloved was their role in medieval medical theory. According to humoral medicine, the belief that health depended on balancing bodily fluids, spices warmed and enlivened the body. They aided digestion, stimulated appetite, and counteracted cold foods like fish or struggling meats. In the medieval view, a spice-laden stew wasn't just tasty, it was therapeutic. If your meal smelled odd, blame the humours, add ginger and carry on. Whether used for culinary glamour, medical benefit, or emergency flavour rescue, spices played a vital role in medieval kitchens. They didn't make food safer, and they certainly didn't fix spoiled meat, but they made meals far more enjoyable, or at least far more confusing. And confusion in medieval dining was sometimes the goal. When your guest took a bite and thought, I have no idea what this is, but I like the cinnamon, that was considered a win. In the end, spices didn't preserve food, they preserved dignity. They softened harsh aromas, brightened dull flavours, and allowed medieval households to serve dishes that smelled less like despair and more like ambition. If the meat smelled questionable, just add more cinnamon. Problem solved, nose ignored. Long before tin cans clinked on factory belts or mason jars sealed with that satisfying pop, medieval people were already experimenting with the idea of storing food in airtight environments. They didn't call it canning, they didn't even realise they were dancing on the edges of future food science. But they understood something profoundly important. If you trap food in a sealed container, you can trick spoilage into slowing down. Medieval sealing wasn't perfect, but it fooled at least half the bacteria. The other half sent their regrets. The idea was simple, even if execution was chaotic. Bacteria need air, and if you remove that air or prevent new air from getting in, food lasts longer. Medieval cooks didn't know why this was true, but they absolutely knew that things stored in sealed jars mysteriously stopped aging as fast as everything else in the kitchen. It was like putting food in time out. Pottery was the earliest and most common vessel for this experimental, not yet canning. Earthenware jars, some glazed and some left porous, were used in nearly every household. The key was creating a seal good enough to keep oxygen out while keeping insects, rodents, curious children, and random household chaos away. Some pots had fitted lids, others were covered with cloth tied tight with twine, others had nothing but hope and a rock on top. In wealthier homes, you might find finely made ceramic jars with snug lids, but even the humblest cottage had some form of clay container waiting to be filled with preserved treasures. To improve these imperfect seals, medieval cooks used the closest thing they had to industrial closure technology: wax. Beeswax in particular was a miracle worker. Melted and poured around the rim of a jar, it hardened into a semi-airtight plug. Wax-sealed jars were sturdy, reusable, and surprisingly effective at discouraging oxygen from joining the party. Wax was also used to coat cloth coverings, turning simple fabric into waterproof lids. If you ever see a medieval jar covered in waxed linen, that's basically the ancestor of modern jar sealing techniques, just more rustic and occasionally lumpy. Food stored in wax-sealed jars varied widely. Fruits in honey or syrup remained stable for months. Cooked meats layered with fat lasted longer than they had any right to. Vegetable pastes, nut mixtures, herbal spreads, and even pottages could be sealed in earthenware jars and tucked away for later. Once sealed, the containers were stored in cool places to slow spoilage further. When a jar was opened, the wax had to be broken, hinting at a tiny, satisfying proto-canning pop, though the medieval version was closer to crack, followed by plislop, still be edible. In warmer climates and more urban areas, amphorae were the star performers. These large clay vessels, inherited from Roman tradition, were designed for storing everything from wine to olive oil to preserved fruits. Their tall, narrow shape and thick walls provided excellent insulation. When sealed with pitch, resin or wax, amphorae became surprisingly airtight. Oil-filled amphorae, for example, could keep cheese or vegetables submerged and protected for long stretches of time. Wine amphorae kept precious vintages safe from air, insects, and over-enthusiastic tasters. Amphorae weren't exactly portable once filled. They were more store this in a corner and don't move it for 6 months items, but they excelled at long-term containment. Another clever medieval solution was sinking containers into cool earth, sand or grain bins. This strategy wasn't exactly about sealing the container, but insulating it and keeping the seal consistent. A jar half buried in sand held its temperature better, kept its lid stable, and deterred pests. Some households even stored sealed jars in barrels filled with bran or straw, which acted like a medieval packing peanut system, soft, insulating, and shock-absorbing. Medieval people perfected this kind of low-tech insulation simply by paying attention to how their food behaved. If a jar lasted longer buried in grain, then grain became storage furniture. Of course, none of these early canning attempts were flawless. Occasionally jars would crack in cold weather, seals would weaken in warm weather, lids would warp or wax would fall off. Some containers became biological experiments no one intended. A poorly sealed jar could turn into a tiny fermentation chamber, complete with bubbles, aromas, and the unspoken question, was it supposed to do that? Medieval cooks learned to evaluate jar contents with cautious optimism. A sealed jar was opened with the same suspense as opening buried treasure. It might contain something delicious, or it might contain disappointment marinated in bacteria. Despite imperfections, these early techniques were revolutionary because they allowed people to store prepared foods, not just raw materials. Cooked dishes could be preserved for future meals, turning feast leftovers into winter reserves. Potted dishes, thick sauces, and sweet syrups found new life in sealed pottery. Households with good sealing skills could build up impressive pantries, filled with jars, pots, and amphorae, tucked into cool corners like edible insurance policies. It wasn't modern canning, but it was close enough to hint at its future. These methods also let food travel. Merchants shipped goods into sealed pottery, confident they would survive long journeys. Pilgrims carried wax-sealed jars of potted meat or spiced paste. Nobles sent gifts of sealed preserves as tokens of hospitality. Monks stored medicines and herbal concoctions in carefully sealed vessels, knowing that their potency would remain stable. In the end, early canning was a blend of instinct, creativity, and a stubborn refusal to let food spoil without a fight. It was not perfect, but it was clever, and for many medieval households, it was the difference between monotony and variety, between scarcity and security. Medieval sealing wasn't perfect, but it fooled at least half the bacteria. The other half sent their regrets. In an age before freezers, refrigerators, or even the comforting hum of anything mechanical, medieval people relied on winter itself as their cold storage assistant. It was crude, inconvenient, unpredictable, physically dangerous, and wildly effective as long as you lived somewhere that winter tried to kill you. Ice was the closest thing medieval people had to mechanical refrigeration, and they treated it with the respect you might give a temperamental dragon. Useful if managed correctly, disastrous if handled poorly. Winter didn't just freeze rivers and lakes, it froze opportunities. When the temperature finally dropped low enough, communities raced to harvest ice like it was treasure. Men armed with saws, hooks, chisels, and an unfortunate willingness to stand on frozen lakes carved massive blocks of ice and hauled them to shore. The process was physically brutal. Imagine cutting through thick ice while trying not to reenact a tragic folk tale involving someone falling into icy water. Winter work was not for the faint of heart. It was for people whose daily lives were already so hard that the idea of harvesting giant, slippery death squares didn't scare them. These ice blocks were then dragged by sledges, carts or oxen to the medieval equivalents of freezers, ice houses. An ice house wasn't a house in the cosy sense. It was more like a giant cold hole surrounded by walls thick enough to repel heat, animals, thieves and curiosity. Most were built partially or fully underground, taking advantage of naturally lower subterranean temperatures. If root cellars were dirt-powered refrigerators, ice houses were winter-powered deep freezers. Inside an ice house, the floor was often sloped or drained, so melting ice wouldn't pool and accelerate thawing. The walls were made of stone or brick and sometimes lined with insulating materials like straw or reeds, and between each layer of ice block workers packed thick layers of straw, sawdust or chaff. These layers acted like medieval bubble wrap, cushioning the ice, preventing it from fusing together, slowing melting, and offering a deeply unappetizing texture should any straw accidentally end up in your food. Constructing an ice house meant acknowledging a few truths. The structure needed to be dark, cold, and utterly unwelcoming. Light and warm air were enemies of ice, so were mice. So were thieves with summer cravings. Therefore, ice houses had narrow entrances, thick doors, and often multiple chambers. The best ones kept ice lusting deep into spring or even early summer, which to medieval people felt like cheating at nature. Ice harvested during the coldest part of winter provided a short but glorious period of nature's free 3-month trial refrigeration. The chance to experience cold food in a world where temperatures normally refuse to cooperate. This refrigeration wasn't subtle. It was a blunt force solution that required hauling, cutting, storing and constantly praying that an unseasonably warm week wouldn't undo months of labour. So what did medieval people do with this ice? They didn't make snow cones or iced lattes, though imagining a medieval monk sipping iced coffee is oddly satisfying. Ice served a very practical purpose, keeping highly perishable foods cold long enough to extend their usable window. Fish, poultry, dairy, and certain fruits benefited immensely. Wealthy households, especially in southern regions, prized ice storage as a luxury. A cool drink in June was a social flex. A summer feast featuring preserved fish or chilled fruit announced, without words, "We have money servants and access to the cold void beneath our estate." The poor, predictably, were less likely to have personal ice houses. Instead, they relied on winter's natural chill directly. Winter storage was about exploiting the environment rather than constructing elaborate facilities. Food was hung outside on cold nights, stored in covered snowbanks, or placed in unheated rooms where frost coated the walls like an extra layer of security. Houses with thick stone walls often had cold rooms or adjoining sheds where winter air flowed freely while keeping animals out. This kind of winter storage was beautifully simple. If the world outside was cold enough to make you consider hibernation, it was cold enough to keep meat from turning grey. People stored barrels of beer, milk, butter, root vegetables, and leftover feast meats in naturally chilled spaces. Nothing sophisticated, just cooperation with nature, albeit begrudging cooperation because winter was never gentle. Snow itself became an occasional tool. In regions with heavy snowfall, snow pits or snow-packed storage chambers acted as natural iceboxes. Food wrapped tightly in cloth or placed in sealed jars could be buried beneath feet of snow, insulated by the very hazard that made travel miserable. Snow was unreliable. One warm day could collapse your entire storage plan, but when it worked well. The problem with winter storage was that it required winter. Regions with mild climates or irregular cold spells had no dependable ice harvesting, leaving them to rely on other methods, salting, drying, smoking, and on the cooler nights of the season. Medieval cooks in warmer areas had to make peace with the fact that the icehouse was a northern luxury, not a universal tool. For those fortunate enough to have access to a well-stocked icehouse, the arrival of spring brought a slow, melancholic awareness. As the air warmed, the icehouse's power gradually faded. Blocks shrank, meltwater dripped, food storage shifted back to cellars, jars, pits, salting tubs, and all the less glamorous terrorist preservation methods. The icehouse had done its duty and retreated into irrelevance until next winter returned with its annual declaration, "Prepare yourself, I am back." In the end, icehouses and winter storage were less about luxury and more about resilience. They used the natural rhythms of the seasons, harnessing cold when it arrived, storing it when possible, and deploying it as long as nature allowed. Medieval ice storage worked great, as long as you lived somewhere that winter tried to kill you. If there was one medieval food that absolutely could not fail, it was grain. Meat spoiled, milk soured, vegetables wilted. But grain was supposed to be the one stable, dependable constant in a world where everything else decayed, froze, or tried to bite you. Grain was life. Grain was currency. Grain was security. And because grain was so essential, everything in the universe seemed determined to destroy it. Keeping grain safe was like fighting a never-ending war against tiny, fur-covered food thieves. Grain storage wasn't simply tossing sacks into a room and hoping for the best. It was a year-round battle that required engineering, vigilance, luck, and cats with strong moral convictions. Medieval people stored grain in granaries, dedicated buildings whose sole purpose was to keep their most precious food supply dry, cool, and unchewed. Granaries were the crown jewels of any farm or estate. Whoever controlled the grain controlled survival. The first enemy was moisture. Dampness was the silent assassin of medieval grain stores. A few days of humidity, a patch of water seeping under a door, or a leaky roof tile could ruin entire harvests. Moist grain didn't just mould, it heated, fermented, clumped, sprouted, and turned into bedding for insects who made no promises about sharing. So medieval granaries were built high off the ground, often on stone pillars or wooden stilts, with floors raised inches or feet above soil. This lifted the grain away from damp earth and allowed air to circulate beneath the floorboards. Some granaries had slatted floors for ventilation, while others used carefully fitted planks treated with lime wash to repel moisture. Then there were the rats, and mice, and voles, and the occasional squirrel with questionable ethics. Grain was the medieval equivalent of a giant free food sign flashing across the countryside. Rodents knew exactly where it was stored, and they treated granaries like all-you-can-eat buffets. Medieval people responded by building granaries with architectural features that would make a modern pest control expert weep with joy. Stone supports were often topped with circular flat stones, called staddle stones, designed specifically to prevent rodents from climbing up. Any rat trying to scale a granary found itself thwarted by physics. Of course, some rats were acrobatic enough to try anyway, which is why cats became unofficial granary staff members. Medieval cats weren't pampered pets. They were co-workers, furry guardians, grain security officers. A granary without cats was a granary begging for disaster. Cats patrolled rafters, stalked shadows, and glared professionally at anything with whiskers. Their presence wasn't just useful, it was essential. You could measure the health of a medieval granary by whether its resident cats looked well fed. Ironically, The cats' robust health indicated that their rat-catching responsibilities were going extremely well. But rodents weren't the only animals attracted to grain stores. Birds swooped in through any crack or gap. Chickens and geese broke into granaries like feathery burglars. Even livestock tried to sneak handfuls if grain sacks were left unattended. Medieval granaries needed secure doors, thick shutters, and latches strong enough to withstand curious farm animals. Some estates even stationed dogs outside to prevent larger creatures from wandering in and wreaking havoc. Once rodents and dampness were controlled, the next threat was time. Grain stored too long grew stale, lost nutrition, and became vulnerable to infestation. Medieval people rotated grain constantly, checking each sack, moving older grain forward, and emptying bins fully before refilling them. This wasn't optional, it was survival strategy. If even one neglected corner of grain became infested with weevils or moth larvae, the entire store could be compromised. And while insects provided protein, that was not the culinary innovation medieval cooks were hoping for. Granaries also had to survive weather. Strong winds, heavy rains, and extreme cold could damage structures, encourage mold, or knock loose roofing tiles that allowed moisture to creep in. Maintaining a granary was nearly as important as maintaining a house. Repairs were immediate, inspections regular, and floors swept more often than medieval kitchens ever were. The granary was treated with reverence. When grain was plentiful, people breathed easier. When grain stocks dwindled, panic set in. Not dramatic panic, quiet, dreadful, looming panic that settled over a household like a winter fog. Storage techniques varied by region. In Northern Europe, granaries were sturdy wooden or stone structures with raised floors and thick walls to combat dampness. In Mediterranean climates, grain could also be stored in clay jars or pits lined with straw and sealed to keep out pests. In drier climates, underground silos were used, with lids sealed tightly over the top. No matter the region, the principles remained. Keep grain dry, cold, safe, and far away from anything with teeth. And despite all these safeguards, accidents happened. Granaries collapsed under heavy snow. Fires destroyed entire harvests. Rats tunneled in. Mold grew unseen. A single breach could mean hunger, hardship, or even famine. This constant threat shaped medieval psychology. Grain wasn't merely stored, it was protected like treasure. A good harvest meant hope. A strong granary meant stability. A weak granary meant fear. Still, the fight was never ending. Grain storage required patience, persistence, and a household willing to chase rodents at inconvenient hours. Medieval people accepted this battle as part of daily life. Bread, porridge, and ale all depended on grain staying intact, so vigilance wasn't optional, it was instinct. In the end, grain storage defined the rhythm of medieval survival. It revealed ingenuity, discipline, and the fierce determination to keep one step ahead of rats, dampness, and doom. Keeping grain safe was like fighting a never-ending war against tiny fur-covered food thieves. But it was a war worth fighting, because life quite literally depended on it. Medieval cooks reached for herbs and spices not just for flavour, but because, whether they understood the science or not, some of these fragrant plants genuinely slowed decay. In a world where spoilage stalked every pantry like an invisible, sour-smelling predator, herbs and spices weren't just culinary choices. They were tiny green and brown shields against rot. If your dinner didn't taste good, at least it died slower. Long before the words antimicrobial compounds existed, medieval people learned through relentless trial and error that certain herbs kept foods fresh longer. They didn't know why thyme outperformed random meadow weeds, or why sage seemed to behave like a leafy little guardian, but they trusted results. Medieval cooking was, after all, a constant negotiation between taste, survival, and what plants hadn't poisoned anyone that week. One of the champions of this botanical army was thyme. Small, aromatic, and surprisingly mighty, thyme grew easily in medieval gardens and earned a reputation as a culinary and medicinal powerhouse. Housewives tossed it into stews, rubbed it onto meats, sprinkled it into broths, and stuffed it into roasted birds, not only because it made everything smell better, but because time genuinely slowed bacterial growth. Of course, medieval people didn't describe it that way. They simply said time kept food wholesome longer, which is medieval code for the chicken didn't immediately betray you after you cooked it. Sage, another herbal hero, played a similar role. Its very name comes from the Latin salvia, meaning to heal, which tells you exactly how people viewed it. Sage was believed to strengthen the body, calm the stomach, lift the spirit, and, crucially, help meat keep longer. People rubbed sage into joints of pork and game, not just for flavour, but because they'd noticed that meat steeped in sage lasted longer before going grey and questionable. It was a subtle preservation help, not a miracle, but when you live in a world where food spoiled faster than your patience, subtle counts. Mustard seeds were another favourite. While mustard was popular for its flavour, medieval cooks discovered that it also helped slow spoilage. Mustard seed pastes and sauces often coated meats, fish, or leftover scraps. The spice's pungency wasn't just a culinary thrill, it created an environment hostile to bacteria. If mustard could clear your sinuses in a single sniff, imagine what it could do to microbes. Medieval people didn't need laboratory equipment to appreciate this. They simply dipped food in mustard and noticed it stayed edible longer, or at least tasted so intense that nobody questioned the freshness. Then there were cloves, tiny dried flower buds imported from the far reaches of Asia, worth their weight in gold, and potent enough to overpower almost anything, including early stages of decay. Cloves were used sparingly because they were precious, but when households had them, they protected everything from stews to wine to roasted meats. Their antimicrobial effect was real, though medieval cooks described it more romantically. Cloves kept corruption away, a phrase vague enough to apply to food, spirits, or father-in-laws. Other herbs and spices played supporting roles in this anti-spoilage symphony. Rosemary, with its piney bite, was rubbed into lamb. Bay leaves, added to broths and pottages, subtly slowed bacterial growth. Coriander seeds flavoured sausages and helped them keep longer. Fennel seeds freshened fish dishes while hindering spoilage. Even humble garlic contributed. Its antibacterial compounds were strong enough that people used it to treat wounds, infections, and anything that needed a medieval disinfectant. But the real magic came when herbs and spices were used together. Medieval cooks often stuffed birds with mixtures of sage, thyme, parsley, marjoram, and garlic before roasting, not because they were following a trendy recipe, but because they'd learned that combining these plants kept the meat edible longer after cooking. Leftovers lasted an extra day or two, a small victory, but in the Middle Ages, extra days meant reduced risk of unintended fasting. Herbal preservation extended beyond cooking. Households hung bundles of herbs in kitchens, storerooms, and pantries, letting the aromas permeate food storage areas. Lavender and rosemary repelled insects. Mint discouraged rodents from sniffing around sacks of grain or flour. Bay leaves were slipped into storage jars of grains or dried goods to prevent insect infestations. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes bugs simply viewed it as seasoning. But enough successes accumulated that these practices became tradition. Herbs weren't just added to food, they were mixed into oils and vinegars for preservation. Infused oils flavoured with rosemary or sage were used to brush over cooked meats before storing them under fat. Vinegars steeped with herbs made excellent marinades that prolonged freshness and added complexity. This wasn't gourmet innovation, it was survival dressed up as flavour. And yet, as effective as herbs and spices could be, medieval people understood their limits. No amount of time could rescue a chicken that had been sitting in the sun for a full afternoon. No quantity of cloves could save fish after 3 days of warm weather. No volume of mustard could resuscitate questionable venison. Herbs slowed decay, they didn't perform miracles. Still, they provided enough extra hours or days to make a difference. In a world without refrigerators, even a short delay was an enormous gift. What makes medieval herbal preservation charming isn't just the practicality, it's the optimism. People believed herbs held protective powers beyond the physical. Sage warded off evil. Rosemary strengthened memory. Thyme conferred courage. Bay leaves brought luck. So when medieval cooks seasoned food with these plants or myrrh, they weren't just preventing spoilage, they were warding off misfortune, illness, and invisible threats. Meals became small rituals of safety, layered with meaning and flavoured with hope. In the end, herbs and spices were the Middle Ages' quiet guardians. They added flavour, extended freshness, protected pantries, and made meals brighter, in a time when darkness and decay loomed constantly. If your dinner didn't taste good, at least it died slower. And sometimes that was all medieval people needed. If there was anywhere in medieval Europe where preservation wasn't just a skill, but a calling, it was the monastery. Monks didn't simply pray, though they certainly did a great deal of that. They also brewed, dried, salted, smoked, fermented, recorded, organised and meticulously managed food, like the entire continent's survival depended on it. And in many ways it did. Monasteries preserved everything: fish, fruit, faith, and the hopes that dinner wouldn't kill them. A monastery was a strange hybrid of spiritual retreat and industrial food laboratory, isolated from cities, surrounded by farmland, and run by men who treated precision as a form of devotion. Monasteries became the unsung heroes of medieval food preservation. Their daily routines depended on predictable meals. Their communities depended on stable storage. Their hospitality, feeding travellers, the poor or wandering nobility, depended on being able to open the pantry without discovering despair. And because these monks believed in preserving both bodies and souls, they kept records of everything. If a method worked once, they wrote it down. If it worked twice, it became tradition. If it failed, well, monks were patient, but even they had limits. Much of a monastery's preservation prowess began with brewing. Monastic beer wasn't just a drink, it was a nutritional safety net. Beer kept better than water, offered calories, and made fasting days bearable. Monks perfected the art of malting grain, monitoring fermentation, controlling temperature as much as the medieval world allowed, and storing barrels for the long haul. The result? Beers that outlasted seasons and tasted so good that pilgrims spoke of them with reverence. Some monasteries became famous precisely because their ale made travellers believe brief moments of holiness might be found at the bottom of a mug. Then there was cheese-making, which monks treated with the seriousness of a sacred mission. Cheese meant stability, cheese meant trade, cheese meant survival in winter. Monasteries churned out wheels of firm, aged cheese that lasted long enough to feed an entire community through the cold months. They refined curdling techniques, experimented with aging environments, and catalogued details with scholarly enthusiasm. If a cheese cracked unexpectedly, monks noted humidity. If a batch soured, they copied adjustments into their ledgers. It was science by candlelight, guided by observation and accompanied by prayers that the next wheel wouldn't collapse into goo. Monks also became experts in smoking and drying, because monasteries had resources that most households lacked. Purpose-built structures. A monastery could afford a dedicated smokehouse or drying loft, maintained with precision and defended fiercely from pests. Fish were smoked in long rows, meat hung from beams, herbs dried in airy chambers, and fruits spread out on slatted racks. These were controlled environments, rare luxuries in a world where most kitchens doubled as smoke chambers whether people liked it or not. The monks' diligent work meant that even months later, smoked eels, dried apples, and strips of preserved beef remained edible, sometimes even enjoyable. And then there was fish, which monasteries consumed in heroic quantities. Monks observed countless fasting days, and meat was off the menu far more often than it was on. Fish, fresh, salted, smoked or pickled, was the monastic answer to survival. Monasteries often built their domains near rivers or seas, or constructed artificial ponds designed to raise carp, trout or eels. These weren't decorative ponds, these were aquatic food vaults. The monks tracked fish populations, harvested sustainably, and preserved their catches with the disciplined regularity of men who believed wasting food might be frowned upon by both God and the head cook. Fruit preservation also reached new heights within monastic walls. Monks turned orchard harvests into dried fruit, fruit pastes, syrups, and even rudimentary jams. Their orchards contained carefully selected varieties, grafted for long-term success. Medieval manuscripts include diagrams for pruning, grafting, and storing apples in cool cellars lined with straw. The monks weren't gardening, they were engineering edible longevity. But the true cornerstone of monastic preservation wasn't just the work itself, it was the record-keeping. Monks wrote everything down. They documented how long a cheese should age, when fish smoked best, which herbs repelled insects, how to construct the ideal granary loft, when to harvest barley for brewing, and the optimal placement of jars in a cool cellar. They created preservation manuals centuries before printing presses made such knowledge widely available. If a monk in Burgundy discovered a better way to store figs, someone in Bavaria might copy that method by the following generation. Knowledge flowed along monastic networks like a medieval internet powered by ink and patience. Their precision made monasteries the logistical centres of medieval food science. Guests, pilgrims, and nobles all benefited from their storage systems. In famine years, monasteries often fed entire regions from their well-stocked pantries and granaries. During long winters, they were the last places where hope survived. When plague or war disrupted trade, the monks' preserved stores kept their communities alive. Daily monastic meals reflected this entire system. Breakfast might include dried bread dipped in ale. Midday meals could feature cheese, pickled vegetables, fruit preserved in honey, or smoked fish. Supper often relied on broth enriched with herbs and leftover preserved ingredients. Every bite was a product of planning, faith, and storage that would have impressed even the most seasoned household cook. By perfecting preservation, monasteries became beacons of stability in an unpredictable world. Their method survived centuries, evolving into the foundations of European culinary tradition. Monks didn't just keep food edible, they kept culture alive. Their techniques preserved everything: fish, fruit, faith, and the hopes that dinner wouldn't kill them. Fresh food in the Middle Ages lived on a clock so unforgiving it made modern expiration dates look generous. Transporting anything perishable, fish, meat, fruit, vegetables, was a frantic race against decay, daylight, weather, animals, and time itself. In a world without ice trucks, insulated crates, or refrigerated ships, medieval people relied on sheer speed, careful timing, and a fair amount of prayer. If your fish arrives smelling like fish, congratulations, that's a medieval miracle. Markets were the beating heart of medieval towns. They were loud, chaotic, crowded, fragrant in ways both delightful and alarming, and full of merchants who had experienced enough transportation disasters to know that selling fresh food required strategy. Most villages had weekly markets, while cities might have markets several times a week. But regardless of schedule, everyone knew the rule: get there early. Food didn't wait for anyone, and if you arrived late, the best produce was already gone, replaced with items that might politely be described as available rather than fresh. The biggest factor shaping food quality was distance. The closer you lived to the source, the better your food tasted. A village a mile from the sea feasted on glistening fish pulled from the water at dawn. A town 20 miles inland received fish that had changed. Not quite rotten, but definitely developing a personality. And a city 100 miles from the coast? Let's just say its fishmongers used spices for a reason. Travel time determined everything. Produce picked at dawn needed to be sold by noon or risk becoming wilted, bruised, or suspiciously soft. Dairy products needed to be rushed to market before they separated into surreal layers. Meat deteriorated so quickly that countless medieval texts warned shoppers to inspect cuts carefully, and to trust no butcher whose stall mysteriously lacked flies, as it probably meant even the insects wanted nothing to do with it. To combat time, medieval delivery methods grew creative. Farmers woke before sunrise, loading carts, baskets, and panniers to begin the long trek to town. Many travelled on foot, some travelled by cart, some balanced goods on poles across their shoulders, and all were locked in a silent competition to reach the market before everyone else. If a cellar arrived late, buyers noticed, and haggled accordingly. Medieval shoppers were ruthless in their pursuit of freshness, and equally ruthless in their refusal to pay full price for a cabbage that had started its journey 3 days earlier. Different foods faced different transport struggles. Milk sloshed, bread crumbled, fruit bruised at the slightest insult, vegetables sweated or shriveled depending on the weather. Eggs survived surprisingly well unless jostled too much. But the real drama belonged to fish. Fish were medieval divas. They demanded immediate attention and punished any delay with aggressive odours. Merchants who lived near the coast sometimes arrived in town still wet from hauling nets hours earlier. Inland, special fish-carrying horses were sometimes used to speed up delivery. Their job was essentially medieval DoorDash for seafood, and that they worked fast because everyone understood one truth: fish waited for no one. River routes helped ease the situation. Boats could move perishable foods faster and with less jostling than carts on bumpy roads. Towns built near rivers enjoyed access to fresher goods, sometimes even exotic luxuries transported along extensive trade networks. Medieval waterways were the highways of the era, quiet, smooth, and blessedly faster than trudging through mud. But even boats couldn't perform miracles. A shipment of fresh produce from 30 miles away might still arrive wilted, cold, or subtly fermented depending on weather and time of year. Long-distance trade routes complicated the story further. Spices travelled continents, wine crossed kingdoms, grain sailed seas, and dried goods made astonishing journeys. These items survived because they didn't spoil easily. But fresh foods making long journeys? That was an adventure and disappointment. By the time fruit from another region reached your table, it had lived several lives, reconsidered its choices, and fully embraced its decline. Medieval people understood this. They treated imported fresh foods as novelties, knowing quality varied wildly. You didn't buy a foreign pear expecting it to taste crisp. You bought it to show your neighbours you had connections. Markets adapted to these limitations by categorising food by distance and season. A fish seller might call out exactly where the catch came from, knowing customers trusted local supply more than anything that had spent hours crossing roads and bridges. Dairy vendors thrived only if they lived close enough to deliver fresh milk before it soured. Butchers tried to schedule slaughter times so meat arrived just as markets opened. Bakers worked overnight so bread was warm at dawn. Everyone involved in the medieval food chain understood that their product had a countdown attached. Climate, too, played its part. Summer travel was easier but accelerated spoilage. Winter slowed rot but made journeys treacherous. Spring brought mud that could swallow carts whole. Autumn offered cooler temperatures but unpredictable storms. Food quality depended not only on distance and time, but on weather patterns that no medieval forecaster could predict with confidence. A storm could delay markets, ruin shipments, or transform perfectly fine produce into tragic compost. Shoppers at markets learned to evaluate freshness with all their senses. They poked apples, sniffed herbs, pressed meat, interrogated merchants, and sometimes held fish up to the light as if searching for moral clarity. Market inspection was an art form, perfected by generations who knew the risks of trusting appearances. A merchant with good reputation thrived. A merchant caught selling old food? That became town gossip faster than you could say, "This fish has concerns." Despite all this chaos, medieval markets worked. The system, imperfect, frantic, and occasionally aromatic, kept towns fed. It required speed, precision, and constant awareness of time. There were no shortcuts. Fresh food was a race, and everyone involved ran full sprint from dawn to noon. And if your fish arrived smelling like fish, congratulations, that's a medieval miracle. If medieval life had a front line, it wasn't the battlefield or the castle gate. It was the household kitchen, where cooks confronted decay, weather, fire, inconsistent tools, unpredictable markets, and the terrifying mystery meat someone bought on sale because it looked fine. Medieval cooks didn't just cook food, they fought entropy. A kitchen in the Middle Ages wasn't a calm, scented place full of copper pots and neatly labelled jars. It was a battlefield disguised as a workspace. Every morning began with the knowledge that ingredients were already aging, already softening, already giving side-eye to anyone thinking about using them tomorrow. Nothing could wait. Daily tasks were shaped by a single rule: use it before it uses you, as an example of bad planning. Fresh perishables dictated the rhythm of cooking. Vegetables wilted within hours, dairy turned rebellious at the slightest temperature shift, meat softened into moral dilemmas, and fish became philosophical about its existence the moment it left water. The medieval cook's greatest tool wasn't the knife, it was speed. Dawn markets opened early, and anyone hoping to serve fresh food needed to get there at sunrise, long before crowds and heat smothered the stalls. A good cook was someone who could scan a market table and distinguish between perfectly fine, use immediately, and this carrot has accepted death. Back home, ingredients had to be sorted by urgency. The freshest went first. The questionable went into stews. The extremely questionable went into pies, medieval cuisine's greatest disguise. A pie crust could hide anything. Yesterday's leftovers, a scrap of meat that had begun to develop philosophical concerns, or vegetables whose best dough were long behind them. Medieval pies were less a recipe and more a witness protection program for food. Temperature was the next great enemy. A medieval home had no consistent heat source. The hearth was everything: stove, oven, grill, but also unpredictable, moody, smoky, and prone to turning a lovely stew into charcoal with a single inattentive moment. Fires couldn't be too hot or too cold, yet rarely cooperated with anything resembling moderation. You didn't set a temperature. You politely begged the fire to behave and hoped your food wasn't planning a rebellion. Cooks adjusted pots by moving them closer to or farther from the flames. Some used tripods, some used hanging chains, and some used stones to raise or lower a pot like a medieval version of temperature control. But no matter the setup, cooks needed to keep one eye on the pot and the other eye on the fire, ready to shove logs in or yank them out depending on whether the flames were sulking or having a temper tantrum. Roasting was even more dramatic. Meat hung on spits, turned by hand, sometimes by servants, sometimes by children, sometimes by a mechanical turnspit dog, a very real breed, though their enthusiasm varied. Roasting required constant rotation. Stop turning and your dinner burned on one side and stayed raw on the other. Cooks hovered anxiously, tending flames, basting, poking, sniffing and hoping guests wouldn't notice if something crisped a little too enthusiastically. Kitchen layout didn't help. Most households had small, cramped cooking spaces with poor ventilation. Smoke from the hearth wandered through the kitchen, the hall, and occasionally the entire house. Eyes stung, clothes smelled like bonfire. The ceiling blackened, pots rusted. Anyone standing too close to the fire perspired like a guilty noble hiding a secret. Summers turned kitchens into ovens. Winters meant the fire burned low and food cooked reluctantly, as if protesting the cold. To make things even more exciting, kitchens collected animals. Cats prowled for mice, dogs begged for scraps, chickens wandered indoors, flies were omnipresent. You had to guard food not just from decay, but from the constant threat of furry or feathered thieves. A kitchen didn't function like a sealed workspace, it functioned like a barely controlled ecosystem. Storage inside the home added its own complications. Cold corners of the house were used for temporary cooling, but temperature fluctuated constantly. Cupboards, chests, shelves and hooks all carried risks. A cupboard too close to the hearth warmed and spoiled food faster. A corner too damp grew mould. A shelf too open invited vermin. Cooks learned the geography of their kitchens like navigators studying coastlines, knowing exactly where cheese lasted longest or which corner stayed cold through winter nights. Leftovers were a gamble. A stew set too close to the fire might ferment overnight. A roast left under a cloth might attract insects. A gravy left unattended might separate into layers, suggesting it needed counselling. If food did survive the night, cooks repurposed it creatively. Boiled again, spiced heavily, mixed into porridges, turned into dumplings, or transformed into the next day's lunch by sheer optimism. Timing was crucial. Meals had to align with the working rhythms of the household. Servants needed early sustenance. Farmers came in ravenous from fields. Children drifted toward the kitchen like moths to flame whenever food smells intensified. Cooks juggled requests, reheated dishes, and served meals before everything cooled into sadness. Hot food cooled quickly, cold food warmed too fast, and nothing stayed ideal for more than a moment. Precision required intuition rather than thermometers. Every day was a dance with entropy, and medieval cooks were master choreographers. They understood their materials intimately, not through science but survival. They tasted constantly, sniffed everything, adjusted flames by instinct, and relied on experience carved into memory by years of battling physics. And yet, despite all the chaos, great meals happened. Not because conditions were easy, but because medieval cooks worked with relentless determination. They tamed fire, beat decay, outran spoilage, and made magic with what they had. Kitchens were the quiet heart of every home, smoky, imperfect, alive, chaotic, and filled with the sound of cooks doing daily battle with time itself. Medieval cooks didn't just cook food, they fought entropy. In a medieval world where water could betray you faster than a rival noble with a grudge, brewing wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Rivers carried runoff, wells carried bacteria, cisterns carried dead leaves and unidentifiable floaters, and stagnant pools carried every medieval disease known to man, plus a few that probably didn't get recorded because the victim didn't live long enough to describe symptoms. Water carried disease. Beer carried happiness. It wasn't a hard choice. Alcohol wasn't just a beverage in the Middle Ages, it was the most dependable source of safe liquid calories. Brewing transformed unstable ingredients, grain, honey, fruit, into drinks that resisted spoilage, nourished the body, lifted spirits, and made daily life more tolerable. And because brewing killed pathogens and replaced them with friendly yeasts, fermented drinks became the closest thing medieval society had to the public health policy. Beer and ale were the backbone of medieval hydration. Most people drank them daily, often at every meal. Not because everyone wanted to live in a permanent state of cheerful tipsiness, but because ale was predictable, safe, and calorie-dense. Brewed from malted grain and mildly fermented, ale had low alcohol content, just enough to keep harmful microbes at bay without sending the entire village staggering into ditches. Children drank ale, labourers drank ale, monks drank ale. Even animals were sometimes given ale-soaked mash when water supplies looked suspicious. Medieval people trusted ale the way modern people trust bottled water. Except ale tasted better and required fewer apologies. Brewing ale wasn't complicated, but it demanded precision. First came malting, soaking grain until it sprouted, then drying it before it turned into a plant with ambitious dreams. Malted grain was crushed, boiled, cooled, and mixed with yeast. Though medieval brewers didn't know yeast was alive, they simply called it balm, or the stuff that makes it work. Once fermentation began, bubbles formed, reassuring brewers that the magic was happening. If bubbles refused to appear, something had gone wrong, and the resulting liquid tasted like wet disappointment. Ale had a short shelf life, often just a few days, which meant brewing was constant. Breweries in towns operated like medieval heartbeats, pulsing fresh batches every morning. Households brewed smaller batches. Monasteries brewed better batches, and taverns brewed enough to satisfy thirsty travellers who arrived dusty, tired, and suspicious of the local water trough. Beer, proper hopped beer, came later to many regions, but where it emerged, it became a revelation. Hops served as a natural preservative, allowing beer to last far longer without spoiling. Brewers rejoiced, housewives rejoiced, travellers rejoiced. Ale still dominated, but hopped beer earned a loyal following because it stayed fresh longer and tasted less like rushed improvisation. Mead, made from honey, was older than recorded history and beloved for good reason. Honey fermented beautifully, turning into a drink that could be sweet, strong, aromatic, or downright heroic, depending on the brewer's intentions. Mead kept longer than ale and required no grain, a lifesaver in times of poor harvest. But because honey was precious, mead was more common in regions with active beekeeping or wealthy estates. It was the drink of celebrations, feasts, and long winter nights when people wanted to feel warm from the inside out. Wine occupied a special place in medieval culture, not just as a drink, but as a symbol of refinement, religion, and wealth. Wine regions enjoyed a distinct advantage. Grapes ferment themselves with minimal human encouragement. Once pressed, grape juice naturally transforms into wine, and medieval winemakers learned how to control the process through barrels, amphorae, and careful attention. Wine transported better than many foods, making it a valuable trade commodity. The church relied on wine for sacrament. Nobles relied on wine for status. Merchants relied on wine for profit, and peasants drank wine when they lived in wine-producing regions, or when an unexpectedly large harvest drove prices down. What united beer, ale, mead, and wine wasn't taste, prestige, or strength, it was stability. These drinks didn't spoil quickly. They didn't carry waterborne illnesses. They didn't make you question your survival choices. Fermentation created an environment where pathogens died, nutrients remained, and calories condensed into sippable form. For labourers chopping wood, farmers scything fields, or artisans bent over workbenches, a cup of ale wasn't indulgence, it was fuel. Medieval people also believed alcoholic drinks were healthier than plain water, and in practice they often were. Water drawn from wells near cesspits, livestock pens, or waste disposal areas could easily become contaminated. Cities especially struggled with clean water systems. Springs and rivers helped, but they weren't always accessible. Boiling water wasn't common practice before the rise of tea culture centuries later, so when given the choice between questionable water and reliable ale, medieval people chose the beverage that didn't try to murder them. Of course, alcohol did more than hydrate, it shaped culture. Taverns became social hubs where people exchanged news, negotiated deals, and complained about taxes. Monasteries perfected brewing methods that would eventually inspire some of Europe's most famous beers. Festivals served mead and wine freely, ensuring celebrations were both lively and slightly blurry. And in households of all sizes, brewing became part of daily life, as familiar as baking bread or tending fires. Still, alcohol wasn't perfect. Brewing took resources. Wine required specific climates. Mead depended on honey. Ale spoiled quickly. But despite these limitations, alcoholic beverages were the most reliable, enjoyable, and life-sustaining liquids medieval people had. In an era where disease lurked in every puddle, fermentation wasn't just a craft. It was salvation in the cup. Water carried disease. Beer carried happiness. It wasn't a hard choice. Travel in the Middle Ages wasn't romantic. There were no smooth roads, no convenient inns spaced evenly along highways, no roadside bakeries offering warm pastries, and no guarantee that the forest you were crossing wasn't also home to opportunistic bandits who believed strongly in involuntary taxation. Journeys were long, unpredictable, uncomfortable, and hungry. That meant travellers needed food that could withstand heat, cold, rain, jostling, time, gravity, insects, and the unfortunate reality that medieval backpacks were usually just bags tied to other bags. Travel food wasn't delicious, it simply refused to die before you did. A traveller's first line of edible defence was dried bread, which was less a food and more a building material. This wasn't the soft, comforting bread of a modern bakery. It was hardtack's grumpy grandfather. Thick, dense, and so dry it crunched like pottery. Medieval dried bread was intentionally baked until nearly all moisture vanished. This prevented mould, extended shelf life, and ensured that if you ever needed to repair a small section of wall, your lunch could probably help. Travellers softened this bread by soaking it in broth, ale, water, or anything liquid enough to prevent dental tragedy. If softened properly, it became edible. If softened poorly, it became a metaphor for suffering. Next came hard cheese, the unbending titan of medieval travel foods. These cheeses were aged so long and pressed so firmly they could outlast the traveller, the journey, and possibly the entire political regime. Hard cheese travelled exceptionally well. It didn't melt in summer. It didn't freeze in winter. It didn't require careful handling, and in emergencies, it doubled as a blunt instrument. You could gnaw on a wedge during long rides or grate shavings into pottage when you finally reached a hearth. Hard cheese was nourishment wrapped in stubbornness, exactly what a medieval traveller needed. More flavourful, but equally determined to remain edible forever, was salted meat. Salted meat was a staple on ships in saddlebags and packed into the rations of soldiers, merchants and pilgrims. Strips of beef, pork or mutton were saturated with salt, dried slightly and stored in barrels or cloth bundles. Salted meat travelled well, but eating it required either soaking, stewing or high tolerance for extreme salinity. A traveller could chew it straight in desperate moments, but only if they accepted that the experience might dry their mouth enough to qualify as a desert environment. For those travelling near coasts or rivers, smoked fish was the portable star. Smoked eel, herring or cod could endure days of travel without spoiling, provided it was wrapped well and kept dry. The smoke acted as a protective barrier, and the fish became firm, savoury and surprisingly nutritious. The drawback? Smoked fish announced its presence to the entire travelling party. If you were carrying smoked fish, people could smell it before they saw you. Wolves probably could too, which added a layer of excitement nobody asked for. Another reliable travel companion was the journey cake, the medieval ancestor of modern energy bars, minus the chocolate and joy. These cakes, sometimes called way bread or travel cakes, were dense, durable mixtures of grain, fat, dried fruit, honey, or nuts. They were intentionally baked until all moisture was gone, because moisture led to mould and mould led to sadness. Some journey cakes resembled compact loaves, others crumbly bricks. Their purpose was simple: last a long time, provide energy, and endure at the bottom of a packed bag without crumbling into powder. Elves in fantasy stories have lembas. Medieval humans had journey cakes, far less magical but considerably more realistic. Dried fruit played an important supporting role. Apples, pears, figs or plums could be sliced thin and dried until leathery and sweet. These dried fruits were lightweight, portable, and offered an occasional burst of flavour in a diet that otherwise leaned heavily toward intentionally bland but survivable. Pilgrims treasured dried fruit because it stored beautifully and even improved morale. After 3 days of eating salted meat and joyless bread, a dried plum felt like a divine blessing. In colder regions, travellers also carried rendered fat or tallow cakes mixed with oats or grain. These calorie bombs kept you alive on long winter journeys and sat heavy in the stomach like a protective blanket made of food. Not glamorous, but remarkably effective. Some travellers brought potted spreads sealed under fat, meat pastes, crushed beans or herb mixtures stored in small ceramic jars. These provided flavour variety and paired well with dried bread. As long as the fat seal remained intact, the food inside stayed safe. Of course, travellers also relied on foraging, but not as their main plan. Picking berries, gathering nuts, or finding edible greens supplemented supplies, but only when terrain cooperated. Most routes were unpredictable, and relying on wild plants alone was a gamble medieval travellers refused to take unless they wanted their journey to turn into a survivalist cautionary tale. Water, unreliable, risky water, forced travellers to rely even more on portable food. Spoiled water could ruin an otherwise perfect ration plan, making drinkable liquids essential. Some carried small containers of ale or watered-down wine for safety, but these ran out quickly. Solid food needed to carry the bulk of survival. The medieval traveller's diet was never luxurious. It was strategic. Every item was chosen because it refused to spoil, crumble, melt, rot, explode, ferment, or betray its owner before the journey ended. Meal enjoyment wasn't part of the equation. You ate to stay alive, to keep moving, to fill your stomach enough to walk another mile. Travel food wasn't delicious, it simply refused to die before you did. If ordinary medieval travel food was bleak, military rations were their hardened, battle-scarred cousins. Designed not for enjoyment but for survival, armies needed calories more than comfort, durability more than delicacy, and predictability more than flavour. War demanded strength, stamina, and sometimes the ability to swallow something that smelled like it had already fought a battle of its own. A soldier's biggest enemy wasn't always the battlefield, sometimes it was dinner. Medieval armies marched on preserved food because fresh food was the first casualty of any campaign. The moment a force left home, their access to local farms became inconsistent, and their access to decent cooking conditions became laughable. Armies travelled with packs, carts, mules, and occasionally ships, all loaded with food designed to survive the rigours of weather, terrain, long distances, and the fact that military organisation was often aspirational rather than reliable. At the heart of military rations was grain, the most compact, dependable, and versatile calorie source a medieval army could carry. Soldiers marched with sacks of barley, wheat or oats strapped to carts or stored in barrels. These grains could be boiled into porridge, baked into crude field bread, or tossed into stews if meat became available. Grain was chosen not because it tasted good, but because it didn't spoil quickly and could feed enormous numbers of men with relatively predictable results. A bowl of grain porridge might not inspire heroism, but it kept soldiers upright. Alongside grains came hardtack, the unyielding biscuit that had the texture of ceramic and the charm of building insulation. Hardtack lasted forever because it contained no moisture and no joy. Soldiers softened it by dunking it into broth, ale, or if sufficiently desperate, whatever liquid they could find that wouldn't kill them. Some men carved thin chunks off the biscuit with their knives, while others shattered it with the butt of a sword. Eating hardtack raw was theoretically possible but universally regretted. Salted and dried meats played a major role in sustaining armies. Beef, pork and mutton were salted so aggressively that eating them straight was an act of bravery. Soldiers typically soaked salted meat in water or boiled it into stews to reduce the saltiness to merely overwhelming rather than lethal. These meats were tough, chewy and reliably edible for months, exactly what commanders needed. They didn't need flavour, they needed food that wouldn't walk away on its own. Armies near coastlines relied heavily on salted fish, especially cod or herring. Much like salted meat, salted fish needed soaking before consumption, unless one enjoyed the sensation of swallowing a briny plank. Soldiers sometimes smashed dried fish into small bits and stirred them into gruel for protein. This produced a dish best described as nutritious, rather than pleasant, but nutritious was enough to keep an army moving. Smoked foods were another warrior's ally. Smoked sausages, smoked eels, and smoked cuts of pork were easier to carry and a welcome break from salt-heavy rations. Smoking didn't make food immortal, but it bought enough time to get through a long march or a siege. Smokehouses back home prepared barrels for campaign season, and soldiers carried bundles or strings of smoked provisions tied to their packs like dim culinary trophies. Cheese also appeared frequently in military diets, hard cheeses specifically, the kind that could survive bouncing around in a soldier's bag for a month without disintegrating or sprouting new civilizations. A good wedge of aged cheese provided protein and fat, didn't spoil quickly, and could be shaved into porridge or eaten with bread. Cheese was especially useful when meat stores dwindled, which they often did. But preservation alone couldn't sustain an army. Medieval forces were expected to forage, and foraging was a polite word for scavenge everything that isn't nailed down. Armies gathered edible plants, stole vegetables from abandoned fields, hunted game, and commandeered supplies from towns that had the misfortune of lying in their path. In many cases, commanders planned campaigns around resource availability, marching where grain stores, livestock, or fishing waters were accessible. Foraging wasn't a backup plan. It was central to military logistics. Barrels were the unsung heroes of medieval armies. Without barrels, storing food for campaigns would have been nearly impossible. Soldiers transported salted meats, fish, grains, biscuits, and even ale in tightly sealed wooden barrels built by coopers whose craftsmanship determined whether the army ate or watched their supplies spoil in transit. A good barrel kept meat dry, grain safe, and fish edible, so a bad barrel made everyone hate the cooper. Cooking in the field was its own adventure. Fires had to be built quickly, maintained with limited fuel, and extinguished fast if enemies were nearby. Soldiers cooked in communal pots, simmering whatever ingredients they had into stews that historians politely describe as practical. Meat, grains, wild greens, scraps of cheese, and hardtack shards all contributed to a dish that could taste different every day depending on circumstances. Sometimes water was scarce, and stews became thick porridge-like creations. Other times, too much water made dinner closest to soup flavoured with despair. During sieges, food scarcity became severe. Civilians and soldiers alike rationed resources closely. Meals became smaller, creativity became essential, and morale became fragile. Soldiers ate anything that could be remotely considered food: leather softened in boiling water, stale bread revived in broth, or meat that had been stored a bit longer than ideal. Historians have records of desperate siege victims eating pets, weeds, and boiled grasses. A soldier's greatest hope during a siege was simply that the defenders held out long enough for reinforcements, or that the enemies ran out of food first. Despite all the hardships, medieval armies functioned because their food systems, rough, salty, gritty, unglamorous, worked just well enough to keep them moving. Soldiers didn't expect fine dining. They expected survival, strength, and perhaps the occasional morale-boosting feast when the supplies were plentiful. Military rations were the gritty foundation of medieval warfare, simple, durable, and almost entirely indifferent to flavour. A soldier's biggest enemy wasn't always the battlefield, sometimes it was dinner. In a medieval town, food wasn't just nourishment, it was a potential crisis waiting to happen. Spoiled meat, watered-down ale, short-weight bread, rotten fish, adulterated flour. The possibilities for culinary betrayal were endless, and because bad food could sicken entire neighbourhoods faster than a bard could compose a scandalous song about it, towns developed food laws and guild systems to keep everything vaguely honest. Guilds tried to stop food fraud. They failed often, but at least they yelled a lot. The medieval marketplace was crowded, noisy and chaotic, filled with vendors shouting prices, customers arguing loudly about quality, and guild officials patrolling the stalls like stern parents checking chores. This wasn't a gentle environment. Food had to be sold quickly, inspected constantly, and defended passionately. The further it travelled, the greater the risk it had embraced its inner decomposition. So towns took matters seriously, or sometimes surprisingly seriously, and created systems to regulate everything from the size of loaves to the smell of fish. The most famous and feared of these regulations involved bread. Bread was life. If a baker cheated, they weren't just dishonest, they were flirting with public outrage. To prevent scandals, many towns enforced strict standards for loaf weight. The assize of bread, first codified in England and echoed across Europe, required bakers to produce loaves of consistent size at consistent prices, adjusting weight based on grain cost. If grain became expensive, bakers couldn't shrink loaves. They had to lighten them according to law, a mathematical nightmare solved mostly by guesswork and hope. Officials weighed loaves in public, sometimes smashing suspicious bread on the ground for emphasis. Bakers who cheated risked fines, public shaming, or forced donations of bread to the poor. In some towns, punishment included being paraded through the streets with your bad bread tied around your neck. Nothing says quality control like medieval humiliation theatre. Butchers faced equally intense scrutiny. Meat spoiled quickly, making butchers the perpetual suspects of medieval food crime. Inspectors regularly visited butcher stalls to check for rotten cuts, signs of fraud, or meat that came from animals which had clearly died from something other than slaughter. If the meat smelled off, the butcher was interrogated. If it looked off, the butcher was fined. If it buzzed suspiciously with flies, no interrogation was needed. The meat was seized and dumped, often along with insults about the butcher's lineage. Butchers who repeatedly violated standards might lose their stall, their license, or, in extreme cases, their animals. Medieval towns didn't play around with meat safety. They couldn't afford to. Then there were fishmongers, who lived in a constant tug-of-war with time, weather and reputation. Fish went bad faster than anything else on a medieval market table, and everyone knew it. Towns passed laws requiring fishmongers to sell only fresh product, forbidding them from washing fish in water to disguise age, and mandating that old fish be removed immediately. Old sometimes meaning more than a day. Inspectors wandered through the fish stalls, sniffing aggressively, poking suspiciously, and occasionally banning sales outright. The fishmongers, in turn, defended themselves with dramatic flair, insisting the fish was perfectly wholesome, even as it emitted its own sermon about repentance. The laws didn't eliminate questionable fish, but they produced impressive arguments that entertained passers-by. Behind all this regulation were the guilds, professional associations determined to maintain standards, protect reputations, and occasionally pick fights with each other. Bakers had guilds. Butchers had guilds. Fishmongers, vintners, brewers, cheesemakers, and vinegar sellers all had guilds. Joining one wasn't optional if you wanted to do business. These guilds controlled apprenticeships, set training standards, dictated pricing, and enforced rules with the energy of people who took bureaucracy as a sacred calling. Guild meetings were famously loud affairs. Discussions about flour purity, meat preparation, beer consistency, or wine dilution could escalate quickly into heated debates, accusations, threats of fines, or dramatic resignations. But beneath the noise, guilds served an essential purpose. They created accountability in a food world that otherwise had very few safeguards. You couldn't just set up a stall and sell whatever you felt like. You needed training, approval, and the guild's blessing, because if your food killed someone, it reflected badly on all of them. Some guilds even introduced early forms of branding. Bakers used distinctive marks on loaves. Brewers used standardized barrels. Butchers hung signs identifying their stall. These markings helped authorities track down offenders, the medieval equivalent of identifying which company made the defective product, except with more yelling and fewer lawyers. Medieval towns also passed laws preventing food adulteration, which, despite constant prohibition, remained a popular pastime. Cellars added powdered chalk to flour, water to wine, sand to sugar, or crushed peas to bread dough to make it rise more dramatically. Inspectors kept an eye out for these tricks, sometimes sampling products directly, sometimes seizing entire barrels to test them. A dishonest brewer might be ordered to drink their own watered-down ale as punishment for cheating customers. This probably worked, because few things are more shameful than drinking your own bad beer while everyone watches. And then there was price regulation. Food markets were volatile, and shortages could cause panic. To prevent riots or price gouging, councils often fixed prices for bread, meat, grain, and fish. Violating these price laws could result in fines or worse, depending on how angry the townspeople were. Nothing motivated compliance like a crowd shouting at your booth. The goal of all these measures wasn't culinary perfection, it was survival. Medieval authorities understood that food fraud, contamination and inconsistency could lead to sickness, hunger and unrest. Even imperfect regulation was better than none. Guilds wielded their authority unevenly, inspectors overstepped or overlooked, and merchants complained constantly. But collectively, these systems managed to keep food standards just high enough that markets didn't collapse into chaos. In the end, medieval food quality control was a blend of law, guild pride, public shaming, loud voices, sniff tests, community memory, and a deeply shared desire not to accidentally poison each other. Guilds tried to stop food fraud. They failed often, but at least they yelled a lot. For all the ingenuity, desperation, creativity, and outright chaos baked into medieval food preservation, Perhaps the most astonishing part is that none of it felt strange to the people who lived through it. This was their world, a world where decay lurked in corners, where fires misbehaved, where winter tested every pantry, where meat had a limited countdown attached, and where freshness was less a guarantee and more a polite suggestion. The good news? You survived medieval food preservation. The bad news? Now you understand why spices were so popular. To grasp how medieval people viewed their food, you have to adjust your definition of normal. Today, normal means refrigerators humming quietly, expiration dates, sealed packaging, temperature-controlled shipping, and fast processors that don't blink at a week-old carrot. Medieval normal meant trusting your nose over any written date, trusting your gut over any packaging, and trusting your neighbourhood cook over any label. Their normal wasn't sterile, it was sensory. Spoilage risk wasn't shocking, it was expected. Households built their daily routines around managing it. Cooks didn't flinch when fish softened or fruit bruised within hours. They didn't panic at milk turning or bread hardening. These were simply facts of life. You dealt with ingredients the moment they arrived because waiting was an invitation for nature to reclaim them aggressively. And if something seemed a bit off, well, that was when boiling, breading, stewing, crusting, salting, spicing or turning the offending ingredient into a pie became the solution. Medieval cuisine was, in many ways, a culinary negotiation with time. Adapted taste played a huge role in why none of this felt particularly alarming. Medieval palates were accustomed to stronger, sharper, more assertive flavours, partly because many dishes were deliberately peeled, salted, pickled, smoked or aged, and partly because the baseline expectations were different. People expected ale to taste earthy, cheese to bite back a little, bread to vary wildly by day, and meat to carry the memory of its preservation method. No one expected standardised flavours. The concept of "this tastes funny" only applied when something tasted truly unsafe, not merely unusual. Cultural attitudes also shaped how people saw their food. Humoral theory, the medieval belief system about bodily balance, taught that foods were inherently hot, cold, wet or dry, and could affect health accordingly. This meant that odd flavours weren't necessarily warnings of spoilage, they might simply indicate a food's natural temperament. A sourness might be seen as cooling, a sharpness might be considered warming. Smells and tastes carried meaning, not always danger. And because these interpretations were woven into medicine and religion and daily life, people trusted them deeply. Community memory also softened concerns. Households passed down preservation methods, recipes, and sensory wisdom through generations. Everyone knew what salted pork was supposed to smell like, how smoked herring should look, how ale should foam, and how far a batch of cheese could age before transforming into a philosophical question. Children grew up watching adults poke, sniff, prod, and taste food with confidence born from experience. This generational familiarity formed a comfort zone that made preservation quirks feel as ordinary as weather. Then there was the ever-present reality of scarcity. The medieval world didn't offer abundant choice. Harvests failed, winters bit hard, livestock died unexpectedly, and climate fluctuations ruined crops. When the line between sufficiency and hunger was thin, people didn't refuse food because it wasn't perfect. They accepted it because it existed. When survival is the priority, flexibility becomes instinct. A slightly sour stew? Fine. Bread that fought back a little? Still edible? Cheese with a personality? At least it wasn't empty space on the table. The communal nature of medieval society further shaped attitudes. People bought from the same vendors, visited the same markets, trusted the same brewers, and relied on familiar craftsmen. Trust built around faces, not brands. If your local fishmonger swore the fish was good, you believed him because he'd been selling to your family for years. If your baker's loaves were consistently heavy or light, you adjusted expectations instead of accusing the bread of betrayal. Food culture wasn't anonymous, it was personal. Religious rhythms added another layer. Fast days, feast days, and liturgical calendars dictated when certain foods could be eaten. Preservation methods often served these rhythms. storing fish for fasts, brewing ale for celebrations, drying fruit for winter feasts. Because food was intertwined with spiritual practice, people saw its transformations as part of divine order rather than signs of failure. Eating preserved food wasn't a compromise, it was a continuation of tradition. And through it all, medieval people found joy in their cuisine. Despite limitations, meals could be comforting, flavourful, lively, communal, and even celebratory. Stews thick with vegetables, bread warm from the oven, cheese sliced at the table, roasted meats perfumed with herbs. These foods brought satisfaction not despite their preservation methods, but often because of them. Techniques honed out of necessity became culinary identities. Smoking gave character, pickling gave punch, aging gave depth, spices gave excitement, survival techniques created taste traditions. To the medieval mind, the daily dance with spoilage wasn't frightening, it was familiar. Preservation wasn't extraordinary, it was expected. Adaptation didn't feel like compromise, it felt like life. And because people developed instincts sharper than any thermometer, they navigated this world with confidence, intuition, and remarkable resilience. In the end, medieval food culture was survival first, flavour second, and acceptance third, but in ways that shocked no one living in it. The good news, you survived medieval food preservation. The bad news, now you understand why spices were so popular.